Mohammed from the World Bank subsidiary IFC, who leads on green homes in Southeast Asia. I say we're particularly pleased because I know many of you will realize it's not just about good intentions, but it's about money. And the fact that the World Bank is encouraging investment into housings that meet green standards is potentially a game changer. So I'm looking forward to hearing that. I'll now say something about, and they've got the three sessions in the 3 weeks in the first session, and I'm going to say a little bit more about why housing has become so important and why we should be making this connection over a distance of 5,000 miles. I think one of the few benefits, you might say, of COVID is it's woken us up to the fact that crises are now spreading throughout the world, and that it's not enough to just keep ourselves safe. We have to think of making the world safe. And whatever happens in the UK, it's as of nothing compared with the what's going to happen as the rapidly growing cities in India begin to urbanize still further. I think that it's very easy to say that the West is to blame for the problems of carbon dioxide increasing in the atmosphere to the point that the world is heating up. But we also recognize that what happens in the West, where towns have largely grown to their full size, is as of nothing, as I say, compared with what's going to happen in India and China, with a rising middle class, with increasing spending power. India now has more cities with over 1 million population than the whole of Europe. Here you can see the different states, and the state that we've are focusing on is Tamil Nadu, right in the deep south of India. And fortuitously, Tamil Nadu has a population a little bit larger than the whole of the UK, over 84 million, but it's roughly the same land area size as England. And you can see some of the main cities on the map, and right at the bottom, Tirunelveli, which we're comparing with Bristol. And by almost a miracle, both Tirunelveli and Bristol currently have populations of around 500,000, and both are growing. Both have great educational facilities and great transport links. So there are some reasons for thinking that comparisons might be made, and that it might be possible to share experience between those two places and people in them. I would say that both countries suffer from problems of public health to do with air pollution, but the air in the bigger India cities is becoming quite intolerable as a result of traffic in particular. So the issue of building is not just about tackling issues of access to housing and promoting equality. And remember that housing is one of the biggest assets that people have, but it's also about doing so in ways that will make public health better for the mass of people. So the future of mid-sized cities is important because they're not yet set in concrete. They have space around them as well as exceptional assets. And our belief is that it's these cities are around 500,000, and there are many of them, where both construction and transport methods can and should be reinvented. So why does housing matter so much? There'll be masses of articles in the next few months about tackling global climate change, and much of that discussion will be directed at nations. But our belief is that it's rapidly growing cities and towns which also have to change direction. And this is not only going to require building differently in different ways, but scaling up our efforts, and above all, changing the way housing is financed and managed. In both India and UK, in Tirunelveli as well as in Bristol, there's an issue of getting hold of land in the right places to create neighborhoods where a mix of people can live together reasonably happily. my own interest in this, I describe myself as a kind of economist, having done economics at various universities, and a kind of planner and urbanist. And with my colleague, David Rudlin, I should say that I set up URBED back over 40 years ago and now direct the URBED Trust. And with David Rudlin, who's a planner, designer, we won a prize, an important prize, for showing how to build garden cities that are visionary, viable, and popular. And in a sense, this was the invention of garden cities, the idea of reconciling town and country, the idea, Howard's great idea of tapping the unearned increment, as he called it, the uplift in land values, to pay for the infrastructure, the roads and the utilities and community facilities that towns need. Those ideas were then applied in the post-war new towns. And I was interested in whether the sorts of ideas could also apply in other parts of the world where a lot of development was going to happen. And I particularly came to see the potential for doing this in southern India when on a visit, in fact, it was a sketching holiday, I came across SCAD for the first time. And I was incredibly impressed by what they were doing. I should say that SCAD is a group of social enterprises set up 35 years ago by Dr. Cletus Babu. And they've gone on to work with hundreds of villages and thousands of women's groups who largely counted amongst what they call the disempowered, or we might say the disadvantaged, or the poor. And I was impressed not only by their philosophy, by the practical way in which they were helping people. And from the beginning, SCAD has been concerned about not just improving people's knowledge and improving their ability to gain access to resources, but also with their impact on the environment. So they planted lots of trees, they built wind turbines, and one of the biggest biodigestion plants that you could ever see on their campus. So you're meeting them in the final session. But next, you're going to be hearing from Girish Visvanatha. Oh, I'm not even going to try and pronounce your name. Sorry, Girish. At Earthonomics. And Earthonomics were involved in evaluating the pilot eco house that we decided to build with SCAD to test out a number of these ideas. And he's going to talk about how well it meets the standards set by the Indian Green Building Council. I have to say that I've been most impressed by the approach that the Indian Green Building Council takes to evaluating projects, because I can understand them. And it seems to me that having simple principles that you can test out is going to be crucially important to getting people interested more widely in the idea of green homes. Then we're going to have Dr. Richard Simmons, who has led the project on behalf of the URBED Trust and is a visiting professor at University College London, and was formerly the chief executive of the Commission for Architecture and Built Environment, which was set up by a previous government to promote higher standards. And during the session, we do encourage you to, whenever you've got a thought that you want to communicate to other people, do put it into the chat function. And Brian Love will be looking through these questions or comments. And so the comments should be in the chat function, and questions that you want to put to the panelists should be in the Q&A box. And in that way, we hope to try to involve as many people as possible, not just as listeners, but as participants. This is extremely challenging because in a normal way of events, we'd be all sitting around a table and seeing each other face to face. But here we're going to see what we can do through this, as I say, miracle of Zoom, which is enabling us to meet simultaneously in a number of countries, India being some 5,000 miles away from the UK. So, Girish, are you ready to go?
Absolutely.
Very good. I'm now going to shut up and let you take over. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So let me share my presentation right away. And just a quick confirmation. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes, it is visible.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. So, yes, I had the opportunity to evaluate the eco-friendliness of this particular SCAD URBED Eco Home at Tirunelveli, and it was an enriching experience to say the least. So, very quickly, before I dive into the aspects of what's gone into this project, a very quick introduction of what I do. I was a part of the earthnomic team that did evaluate the project.
It was when you register. Okay, I'll translate it.
Could I kindly request everybody to go on mute, please, because we are hearing an overlay. Thank you so much. All right, so I'm a part of the R&D team of this Singapore-based company called Cheese Square, wherein I thought it would be very interesting to give a 2-minute introduction to what I do currently. So what if we could assess any building anywhere, anytime, instantly at super low cost? Now, this is possible using a technology called digital twins, wherein any existing building can be turned into a 3D model on a map-based platform. And once it's translated into a map-based platform, you could evaluate the savings potential of a particular building by knowing its history. So this is what I am doing at Cheese Square right now, and this platform called Better Life helps churn out green buildings at a faster rate and evaluating them at a really rapid mode. Okay, now having said that, let me get on to the project right away. So very quick snapshot of the building, that the home, the eco-friendly home that we are talking about. Certain things would immediately come into the picture. Number one is, surrounded by trees on various levels. You can see there is a small little leveling that's done before the house is constructed. We'll come to that. And mainly something that catches your eye immediately is the kind of greenery that's around the building. So very quickly, how did we evaluate how this building actually, how this eco-friendly home actually stands out compared to any other development? So what we did was took the details of the building from the satellite imagery that is available as an open source, and we translated and converted this into a 3D model, or a digital twin as you call it. So a digital twin is a replica of the actual building wherein you could do all your trials and testing. So instead of doing it on the prototype, on the physical prototype, you do all your testing on a 3D virtual clone of the actual building on site. So this is exactly what we have done here. Created the building, simulated it, and plugged in all the available surrounding aspects such as the trees, the shades, etc. And let's see what the results are. So if you take a look at the most important aspects that have gone into the building, there are a lot of efforts taken to reduce the urban heat island effect, which is one of the key causes for issues, especially in the Indian subcontinent, wherein the summer temperatures can be anywhere between 5 degrees to 10 degrees more than the ambient temperature. Now, this is because of rapid concretization, wherein all the concrete surfaces absorb the heat and let it back into the atmosphere, as a byproduct of which we experience really hot waves and issues associated with increased temperature. This includes, people getting strokes, loss of flora and fauna, loss of a lot of native species. So all these issues are there. So these are some of the techniques that were adopted by the home, surrounding by trees, planting a lot of saplings. As you can see, you see a lot of air purifying plants over here, and something very interesting that's catching the eye of a lot of people worldwide: coating the roof with white color reflective surfaces. Now, the easiest way to do this is to paint your roof white. But if you can see what we have done here, we have reclaimed broken china mosaic tiles and laid them on top, because it's the color white that promotes the reflectivity. And as we know, the visual component of sunlight, which can actually, upon hitting surfaces, get converted into absorbable heat, and thereby it's really uncomfortable. So these are certain techniques. In continuation with that, You can also see that we have a 2 kilowatt solar panel which generates a lot of power. And apart from that, you can see the gap, the air gap between the facade and the wall, which further acts as an insulation. Just going forward, now what does this entail? What does this translate into? I'm just gonna see if I can. Okay, so this is a test done on the 8th of May, which is the hottest day for this particular region of Tirunelveli. If there weren't trees around the site, you can see that the site temperature is 42 degrees Celsius. Now with trees around the site and the cooling impact of the trees, the temperature has dropped by 7 degrees Celsius. So every time there is a wind that blows in this particular region, we can estimate that the air comes in at 35 degrees Celsius and not 42 degrees Celsius. Another very important point, because the site is 7 degrees lesser than ambient, it also attracts winds, which in general, okay, flow at a 20-meter plane because of the urban heat island effect alone. So this is one of the direct impacts. Going forward, what we have also done is estimated the air movement through this particular home. As you can see, this is the entrance of the home, and a significant amount of wind comes in from the southwest direction, or rather west of south direction. And if you can see, the openings are in such a way that there are openings on the south direction and in the north direction, promoting significant amount of cross ventilation. So we are in the COVID times right now, and there's a saying that goes this way: flowing water does not breed mosquitoes, and this is very true as far as a green home is also concerned. When you have flowing air through the home, the pathogens will not breed, and there is continuous evacuation of any kind of growth, be it viral, be it bacterial. So it's not only promoting energy efficiency and eco-friendliness, now as a byproduct of which health is also an important factor that's passed on as a benefit to anybody who occupies this home. All right, combined with, so as I told you, the cross ventilation technologies are such a way that you have more than two openings. You have openings in over two facades of the same house. Thereby there is continuous evacuation of air. Further, to reduce the temperature, if you can see, the ground gains are significantly high in a place like India, wherein the ground gets heated up, and through the bottom of your, to the underlying surface of your home, this heat gets transferred inside your home. So both the roof treatment and the floor treatment were done, as a byproduct of which additional insulation was ensured. Now by doing all this, ensuring that the urban heat island effect is minimized, by ensuring there's a lot of cross ventilation, by ensuring there is significant amount of insulation, we took care of all the three formats of heat transfer: convection, conduction, and radiation, and thereby reducing all the three forms of heat. The result is there in front of you. I'll probably start off with the hottest month of the year, when the peak external temperature is 38 degrees. The real field temperature around that area is 42 degrees because of the land absorbing the heat and radiating it back into the atmosphere. However, this particular site had an average temperature of 35 degrees during the peak day, and the temperature internally was 31.85, roughly about 6 degrees, over, let us say, about 7 degrees Celsius lesser than outside. And the number of air changes, this is a significant result that we got because of the cross ventilation. As a byproduct of maintaining cooler indoor environments, we attracted a lot of wind inside the building, and there were about 40 air changes inside this building. The norms as per the National Building Code is about 6 to 8. That makes a home a really healthy home. But then you can imagine what happens with 40 degrees Celsius, and as a byproduct of which everything adds on together. The temperature is lesser, the people are healthier, and I'm very, very happy to tell you that this home does not have an air conditioning system. It operates passively because this kind of comfort conditions can be met. As you can see, across the year, because of the various wind orientations, the air changes are significantly more at other times of the year. And when we come to the months of January, February, and December, the cooler months, generally the air changes are less, but then the temperature is so comfortable inside, even in a natural way. Going forward, there were so many other aspects. I've just spoken about the health and the thermal comfort aspect of it. If I have to speak about all the other green building aspects that went into the project, 90% of all the material source for this eco home is locally manufactured. Thereby, this project did empower the local manufacturers, the local artisans, the local laborers. So it was not just green from a building point of view, it was also green from how it started enabling the population in and around the project. So that was very interesting part. So it's sustainable in the true sense. Then there was a lot of recycled and reused materials used in the project. As you can see in the picture, all these clay tiles that you're seeing have been salvaged from another site. They were washed, treated, and reused in the project as insulating devices, and thereby you could see the difference. There was a temperature drop of about 6 to 7 degrees in the peak month, and this probably contributed to at least 2 or 3 degrees reduction in temperature. So eco and all the products had a lot of recycled content like fly ash, recycled steel, reclaimed clay tile that you see here, and there is no material that was wasted. For example, even the kitchen and garden reuse, even after the building was constructed, the waste that is generated today is being processed in some very traditional methodologies using these vermicomposting pits that churn out manure every 15 to 20 days. You can see that these are some stone girders that have been reused for support systems within the project. A significant reuse of fly ash bricks that have significant amount of recycled content. These added on to the project's green value or the sustainable value. Now, some very interesting aspects here. This is a rainwater harvesting system, constructed in the traditional methodology. All the taps were fitted with aerators so that the flow rate is restricted to 2 liters per minute, and thereby, compared to a conventional home, this home could save about 50% of water. Not just that, some very smart, innovative methodologies. In India, this is called as jugaad, or quick fixes, DIY fixes. So what you can see here is a 1 liter bottle filled with water is placed inside the flush system, so that 1 liter of water gets displaced, and as a byproduct of which a 4 liters per flush tank has now been converted into a 3 liters per flush tank, thereby saving 1 liter with every flush. So these were also, and you can also see that this is a dual flush system. So you can imagine the savings in water just by doing a very small measure of displacement, the most basic physics that we have learned. So as a byproduct of all this, now this is one building one home wherein the idea wasn't to take a look at the IGBC checklist and start ticking the boxes and start making sure that each and every feature mentioned in the standard is implemented. Instead, the approach was very different here. The building was constructed, and because the sustainability practices were in place, we just had to pick up these sustainability practices, and we tabulated, we started evaluating it. And once the marking system came out, it was very straightforward for us. We got a 63 out of 100, thereby achieving the platinum rating. In fact, we also understand from the Green Building Council that this project can also be pursued as a net zero building. The 2 kilowatt solar panel on the rooftop of this particular building caters to 100% of its electricity requirements. Thereby, not just a passive greenhouse, it also is really close to a super low energy building or a net zero energy building. Just a quick snapshot, we've got almost all the points, 9 out of 9 as far as site selection and planning is concerned. All the amenities were really close, stones throw distance away. People need not start their vehicles to procure something. They just have to take a walk within the campus or probably a little outside the campus to meet their ends. Water conservation, except for the treatment part of it, which was really not required for such a small home, we had everything else in place. Energy conservation, we again did not opt for specific things like solar water heater. Instead, we had the solar water panel and materials. You can see we got a huge chunk. Indoor environment quality is probably one of the key aspects of this particular building, scoring a 13 out of 15. And innovation, there was no we weren't short by any means in terms of innovation, be it the native technology as far as biocomposting is concerned, or the rainwater harvesting system is concerned, or the organic garden that you'd hear about in some time. All these aspects were absolutely in place, as a byproduct of which getting a platinum rating wasn't difficult at all. And this home also got featured as one of the top 50 green rated buildings in the country last year, and it has got featured in the IGBC coffee table book for the country. And as you can see here, we have a platinum certification here, and that's about it. I'd be very happy to take questions.
And we're going to leave the questions to the end after we've also heard from Richard Simmons. So don't worry, we'll be coming back to you. What's already struck me is the simplicity, in the sense, of the Green Building Council system. And it'd be very interesting to consider how that compares, or whether it's a similar system is used in the UK. I was very impressed too by your ability to model the impact, so that you could be looking at a whole lot of houses before they were built to see how one could be improving. Well, one last comment is that the tendency in India, as in the UK, is to sort of build high and to build out of concrete. And what we've been trying to do with this eco house is to show a different system, which is much more responsive to what individuals can do for themselves. I know that they've harvested 82 kilograms of vegetables off the roof, and I like the idea of being able to use the space and personalize it, which of course is impossible, almost impossible to do in a block of flats. Now, Richard Simmons, you've been leading the project from the trust, and you've also had the benefit of another evaluation on viability that we've done. So can you now come in?
Absolutely. And I hope you can see my screen. Thank you very much. Yes, by the way, if I'm looking to the right a bit, it's because I'm using two screens. Let me see if I can change that. That's better. Yeah, so I was the URBED Trust's project leader on this project, but I want to stress right from the start, this is an Indian project. So Nick inspired SCAD to want to build this home. Vidya Mohan Kumar and her architects team are the people who actually designed it. SCAD then organized the contractors and labor, and Dr. Visvanathan did the evaluation for us. So this is an Indian project, but we think we can learn quite a lot from this project, not just for India, but for everywhere, and particularly for the UK, but for other countries. So my job today, having heard how fantastic the Eco Home is, and I feel very proud of having been involved in the project, having heard Girish, is to, as it were, knock it down a bit, because what I'm going to do is provide a provocation, and what I hope is that from this provocation, we'll hear some really great ideas about dealing with some of the challenges that we still face in getting this kind of project, this kind of house built everywhere. Now, of course, the technology is going to be different for the UK. For example, in Tamil Nadu, wood is a much scarcer resource than it is in the UK. So it's not really available quite so easily as a renewable building material as it is in Europe, say. So there will be differences in the technology, but underlying the technology are cultural issues and economic issues that I think we need to talk about. So Nick made the point that this is not actually a house that conforms to what is rapidly becoming the normal expectation in many parts of India. And this is obviously a generalization, but there's a very powerful concrete industry in India. And everywhere you go now, you see concrete frame buildings with concrete block walls. The aspiration is to have lots of glass in your home and to have air conditioning. And as Girish mentioned, we've actually overcome the need for air conditioning, but that's the expectation that many people have. And so in some ways, the home we built is fascinating because it contains many traditional elements that have been very common in India for centuries, millennia even. and yet somehow those traditional methods of building are either being forgotten or ignored in favor of what people regard as a more aspirational form. So, for example, the scheme, as Girish said, is separated from the ground, and we used recycled stone in the project to achieve that. So building out of stone rather than concrete, which required masonry skills that are becoming quite scarce now. It used a novel technique called rat trap bonding, which was developed by Laurie Baker, who was a British architect who went to work in India in the 1940s and developed a whole load of new ways of adapting traditional
Richard,
Indian
I think you're intending to use images, but they're not coming up. I'm not sure why that's not happening.
That's very curious. What can you see at the moment?
All we can see is the title, The Challenge of Scaling Up. Have you shared your screen?
I have shared my screen, yes. I'll stop sharing it and try sharing it again. I apologize for that. So what you should be able to see is a PowerPoint presentation.
Oh, we do now. You're now showing the slide with the floor. Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
Something very curious has happened to my presentation. Just give me one moment, please. I do apologize for this. Okay, I'll start again. If this doesn't work, I'll ask John Breach to bring it in for us as our facilitator. Is that visible?
Yep. We can
Good.
see
So you can see some people building a stone structure at the moment.
Yep.
Excellent. Okay. We'll hope this works this time. So I was just talking actually about the next slide, which is rat trap bond, which is a way of creating air cavities in the walls, which help to insulate the home. So that's clearly not a concrete frame with concrete blocks in it. We use new technologies as well, of course, and Girish has already mentioned the photovoltaic panels on the roof, and that's a novelty. Interestingly, although India has a lot of sun at the moment, its solar industry is still very much in the developmental phase. Internally, aesthetically, it was decided to use a form of mud plaster, which is very traditional in India. And I'll just say in a moment why that's an issue. And we also had some interesting structural techniques. So, for example, the filler slab, which you see on the upper left, uses ceramics to replace some of the concrete that would normally go into a concrete slab roof. This reduces the weight of the roof, but specifically it also reduces the amount of concrete. And of course, concrete is one of the most environmentally damaging materials that we use at the moment, and it's ubiquitous. We find this everywhere. And so by using the structural strength of the concrete, but in a matrix rather than in a slab, you get a similar kind of strength. But the challenge there is that some engineers were perplexed by this method of building because the normal Indian building standards are for slabs. As you can see, we do have some mechanical ventilation, but it's only traditional fans. And we've already heard about the way that the roof has been made. Very interestingly, these people walking around on the roof, Nick and I also walked on the roof in the height of summer in bare feet, which you just can't do on a normal roof in Tamil Nadu. But again, that's not how roofs are normally built in Tamil Nadu. So we think that the result is a very attractive building, and Girish's efforts in analysing it have actually shown that Vidya and her team's design work and all the work that SCAD put in to construct this in this novel way has been really successful. So this is a home it will be really nice to live in. So we talked to some local people about what they thought of it. They were staff who worked for SCAD on the campus and who were interested in having a new home. And we asked them to go and look at the house, and then we sat down with them and we conducted a little survey of them and asked them for their comments. And what was very interesting was that They really loved it. They really thought it was a wonderful house, but they really doubted whether they would actually want to go and live there. And one of the reasons for that was cultural. And the issue was what their mums and dads would think of it, because what they said was that in their part of the world, when you buy or rent a home, you get your mum and dad to come and look at it first and see what they think of it. And this house does not look like new houses that are being built all over Tamil Nadu at the moment. This house is not made of concrete. It isn't rendered on the outside. It's got visible brick. And it's got all those interesting features. So the mud plaster, for example, and also actually there are compacted floors in there, rammed earth floors. They're regarded, they said, well, why would you want to live in a house that looks like a house that poor people live in? Because somehow an association of very traditional forms of building has become instead associated with the way that people used to live, not the way they should live in the future. And I think this is very analogous. I spent a lot of time at CABE conversing with British house builders about the style of British house building, which is really not very sustainable at all. Now here, exposed brick is the thing, but they said, well, no, we don't want to build in new materials because people are used to these materials and they don't want to change. And why should they change when that's what they're used to? And so we don't make our bricks like these bricks were made, which is principally sun-dried with a bit of baking to finish them off. We actually bake them at a very high carbon-intensive level. So what does that mean for our ambition? And this is where I'm going to lay down the challenge. Our ambition is that we should start to see neighborhoods like this with the kind of homes that we've been developing in Tamil Nadu, with lots of green infrastructure, very connected, but designed for their context locally with, for example, sustainable water solutions like Girish mentioned. Charles, who's with us here from SCAD, had some local architects draw up the vision for a neighborhood with homes like the one that we piloted. And we think this is a really great way to bring new people to live in medium-sized cities and towns in ways that don't cause the kind of concrete high-rise and environmentally unsustainable housing we're seeing a lot of around the world at the moment. But we learned a lot from this pilot, and three things stand out for us that I think are common issues for today's session. The first is we need to build a market for homes that are green and sustainable. And at the moment, there are people who want green homes, but it's not the massive consumers. So building the market, the consumer may say, my mum and dad won't like it, and there's no air conditioning. How do we deal with that? The engineer, we know this from talking to them, it's not made of things that we trust. And the consumer, similarly, well, it's not like the houses we're seeing built elsewhere at the moment. The developer, hearing that, may say, well, this isn't aspirational in the way that a house with lots of glass and air conditioning and a fancy drive where you can park your fancy car is, and it won't sell. And the landowner may say, well, all these things cost a bit more, don't they? So I can sell for more without the cost of all this green stuff. Let me just say in passing, because I'm not sure anybody else will pick this up unless Charles does later. We've had this house evaluated by Dinesh, one of our colleagues in India, and his report is available on the website that Nick mentioned. This house actually cost less to build than a conventional house, not by much, but it was actually cheaper to build than the conventional Indian concrete structure. So I'll just pick that up for the moment. But there's a definite feeling, I think, from talking to landowners and developers that all this stuff is going to cost them more. How do we deal with that perception? Then we need to find money and finance. And this is where I hope our TIFI is going to help us, because if the engineer won't certify it, or the developer won't build it, or the consumer won't demand it, or the landowner won't supply the site, who's going to have the confidence to fund this? The World Bank clearly is a great lead, but we've got to get other banks to do this in a conventional way. And the final thing we learned was that all these skills for building this kind of home are available. but they weren't available locally in Tamil Nadu in many cases. And Charles and Vidya had to bring people across from Kerala to train the workers to build this home. Now, if you know the area at all, you'll know that bringing somebody from Kerala in to teach somebody in Tamil Nadu how to do something is a bit of a problem, because there's a bit of a rivalry between the two states. But these are all skills that used to exist in plenty. And our colleague Dinesh has been doing a lot of work to bring them back again, as our SCAD. But we've got to build the skills in the workforce. Now, in India, that's one set of skills. In the UK, it's a different set of skills, although some of them are similar, but some of the skills are going to be different. But we need workforces who can build these homes and who can maintain them and who can extend them in the future in ways that are compatible with how they've built how we've built them in the first place. So I think these are all questions that we hope we're going to address in the rest of this seminar today. And thank you very much, Nick, for the opportunity to get that message across.
Can I now bring in Brian Love? I'm not sure that we're getting the questions in the number that we were hoping, and I do encourage you all to, if you've got thoughts or concerns, to put them in. As was stressed, these ideas, whilst the context is very different, the challenges are very similar. And it was this approach of driving out waste, of looking at each element and seeing how it could be done differently, which seems to me the most important lesson to be drawn from the process. Now, we've already been asked the question, this is all very well if you're doing it a single-story house, but what about multi-story houses? Surely land is valuable enough where you need to build at several levels. So, Girish, would you like to comment on the whole question of what happens if you start building in this way at a multi-story level? And I'd made the point that our hope was that a house like this could be extended as resources allowed, so that people would put another floor on top of what's been built, or would extend it by another room at the side. But Girish, what's the implication once you start going to scale?
Okay, so the first implication here is that, number one, the dependency. We have to absolutely make sure. I think one of the key points that Dr. Richards is also talking about is that why would I waste my land space on the greenery, and why wouldn't I want to capitalize on that with additional area, which in turn turns into, additional revenue for me. I think that is one mindset that we first need to address. We have to allocate a portion of the land to nature and then start our construction. Having said that, yes, footprint is very important. And as we start going, as we start expanding vertically, we do have to take a look at what are the other sustainable features that can be brought into the picture. For example, can I go for, I definitely have to increase the foundation strength. So that is one of the areas. But then having said that, I could still continue scaling my walls using the same set of technology, same set of fly ash bricks with high recycled content, the rat traps. All that is going to be still applicable for the additional floors or stories that I want to implement. So that wouldn't compromise on the green quotient of the building in any way. You could still continue to maintain a balance.
Nick, could I add to that? By the way, Nick, there are some questions coming up in the chat as well as in the Q&A.
Oh, right.
So
well, Brian, I'm going to ask Brian in a moment to bring those questions in.
Yes. So I think it's important to say that when we were talking to SCAD and Vidya about the design concept here, one of the things we were looking at was how we could actually scale up vertically. And that's also covered to some extent in the report that Dinesh produced that's on the Smarter Urbanization website. There are, I think there's some challenges which are, again, about perception and concept. So one of the concerns from the engineers is whether or not the type of flooring that you would get if you converted, as it were, the roof made with a concrete matrix into a floor, whether that provides sufficient lateral support across the building. I think structurally speaking, that's already been demonstrated elsewhere as something which works. But in each regulatory context and in each engineering tradition in every part of the world, these are the kinds of questions that have to be resolved by pioneers. And one of the reasons for doing the kind of project we were doing was to test that. So I think structurally speaking, there's nothing to stop us going higher. And in fact, Dinesh has been working on some concepts for multi-story. It will probably affect to some extent the issues around the reflective roof, the urban heat island effect, because you've got more mass of structure with less roof area to help with cooling. So you'd have to look, I think, at the cross ventilation quite carefully. So it's definitely technically possible. I think financially also that there shouldn't be a huge barrier to it, because it is just brick on brick, you know, and that seems to be in this context, brick on brick is something which, once you've got a bricklayer trying to lay bricks on bricks, they'll just go on laying bricks on bricks until you tell them to stop. And these are structurally, we had the bricks tested, they're structurally pretty robust, you know, they're good standard, good quality bricks. Okay. So I think, yes, we can go higher.
Okay. I notice, by the way, we're already running out of time, but Brian, bring in some questions.
Yes, I can just add that Laurie Baker Foundation have built both 4-story and 7-story blocks of flats using this technique. So it's definitely there. There's a question here from Steve Boxall, which says, are there or could there be separate markets that for the wealthy built from glass and concrete, and also those who could never afford to develop or build homes? So the question here before us really is, should there be two markets, one which are high carbon and one which is low carbon?
Can I leap in with that, Nick?
Interested to see what the speakers think of that.
Yeah, I want to jump in very quickly and say the problem isn't the poor. So the poor are not causing climate change. The poor are the victims of climate change. And they're the victims of climate change because the rich are building with concrete and glass and driving gas-guzzling cars and so on. So I think actually, morally speaking, you might argue that that's not acceptable. Having said that, that's probably the way things will go, because the rich are the rich and they get what they want. But actually, I think what we should be trying to do here is convert the rich. And in fact, one of Nick's really interesting ideas, I think, was that a big market should be the new middle classes, not just the poor. And I know, again, from my work on social housing in the past, that people quite often don't like to have imposed on them that which the rich won't accept. Right. So I think we should not fall for that one, I think.
Okay.
Can I just come in there? Can I just add to that what Richard just said?
By all means.
Yeah, hi, this is Bimal here. And one of the recent projects we worked on in Hong Kong was for developing a net zero bungalow for a billionaire. So basically there is, interest as well, even from the rich people, to have homes which are net zero and how they can be built. I thought I should just throw in that example there.
Yes, thank you. I mean, there's also a question here from Jeremy Sweetland that says, interesting looking at social influences and consumer-led change, but what is the interplay needed for tighter regulations and planning when many developers still cost is their key driver? So do we think that this should be driven by regulation as well as led by example?
I'd probably quickly come in here. So what's happening in certain states within the country, even in India, is that green buildings have started attracting incentives from the government. For example, if this particular building had come up in a different state wherein there are incentives, you could get up to 15% additional floor area ratio as a reward. So what would probably happen is that this is typically what happens in other parts of the world as well. In fact, Singapore is famous for this. We do see Israel pick up the same module. We see parts of the Middle East also incentivize green buildings. By promoting incentivization, you could actually not just make up for the additional cost spent on the green building in terms of solar, in terms of any other effort that's gone into the building, you actually end up pocketing more profits. So it's actually a win-win scenario for the consumer who's going to occupy the house, because he gets to live in a healthy house that has a lesser carbon footprint. And in case the developer has taken the effort to make this green by plugging in a lot of features, he also gets a return on his investment. So I think this kind of incentivization process is prevalent in certain states. Once it becomes a national agenda, I'm pretty sure more green buildings are going to come up.
Thank you. Nick, I'll hand back to you now, because I
Okay,
realize
well, we're going to have to close at that point for a break, but you please keep switched on, and we'll start again at 11. Can I, in 5 minutes' time, can I just make the point that came up in chat, that it also there's a role for pioneers, and the pioneers could well be teachers or nurses in groups who may want to live in a different way, or be happy to live in a different way, and then it suddenly is seen as the smart thing to do. I think what we've got to promote is the notion this isn't just for the good of the planet. It's actually a good thing to do for yourself, and that the house that you buy will actually be worth more over time than some of the conventional houses that we see being built. So let's see you all back at 11 o'clock to start with Neil Murphy on what's been learned from the project to build an innovative scheme in Cambridge. Yes, that would be lovely. It's 11 o'clock, and I'd like to welcome participants and panel members back for the second session, which is about scaling up and the question that was raised by Richard about wider markets and how one can make the idea of green homes popular to a bigger market. And one of the ways of doing it is to create schemes that win awards and get widely publicized. And one of the best examples of that we're now going to hear about from Neil Murphy, who is the developer, one of the developers of a really innovative project with a marvelous name of Marmalade Lane in Cambridge. I happen to know the site where it was developed because of work that I've done in Cambridge on the Equality Charter. And I know that on the whole, the scheme is rather ordinary, but it's great to see at the end of this big new scheme, something that perhaps should have been started at the beginning to create a model. So Neil, can you come in and explain to us in hopefully about 10 minutes what is special about Marmalade Lane and co-housing, and talk about innovative housing generally, how we're going to get it on a bigger scale.
Thanks very much, Nick. Hope you can hear me okay and see my screen okay. Lovely to see you all in this absolutely fascinating discussion. I'm learning a huge amount from listening. I'm going to sort of try to just give you some perspective from our experience. Town, my company, is a SME developer, the kind that the government professes to want to encourage more of, but which are still fairly thin on the ground owing to the structure of the industry in the UK. And I'm going to try to sort of talk both about Marmalade Lane and about the lessons from it that are relevant in the UK and hopefully in India, around how we can get more sort of community-led and resident-produced projects. So talking about Marmalade Lane, Marmalade Lane is a community of 42 dwellings, about 105 people at the moment on a 1 hectare site, an almost perfectly sort of orthogonal 1 hectare site in Orchard Park in Cambridge. It was the last but one parcel of a large urban extension called Orchard Park, which at the time that Marmalade Lane was brought forward had already had around 800 homes delivered, mostly by speculative volume house builders during the 2000s. Quite a good master plan with a reasonable block structure, but just not executed well because of poor architecture and construction, and just for a place with pretty good public transport connections, including the Cambridge guided busway, but what really are rather excessive parking requirements. The area had a reputation for transience and low engagement, partly because many of the private homes had been turned into HMOs. Basically, you know, the challenge Cambridge has as a booming city is that its housing has not kept up, and so quite a lot of people are squashed into relatively small multi-family households. And the land parcel, which was known as Parcel K1, was owned by Cambridge City Council, and it was approached in the late noughties to pilot some community-led housing. A sale of the site to another volume house builder having fallen through in the financial crash. Now, Town won the developer competition in 2015, which was really well designed to allow new entrants to compete, and the scheme was completed in 2018. Here we are at the groundbreaking in more senses than one with the group, and the project was really governed throughout by deep collaboration between the development team and the community group. In particular, we and our delivery partners, Tirunelveli, which is a Swedish timber framing company, effectively set up a process that involved the residents from the outset, taking their high-level brief and turning it into detailed design solutions, and indeed management strategies and sales processes for the scheme as a whole, looking at different work streams of the key components of the co-housing community. So briefly to summarise those. Takes a very low carbon approach with, I mean, what now needs to become the norm, but in 2015 it still wasn't normal not to have natural gas as your heating. Air source heat pumps will be everywhere now in the UK, but they weren't at the time. So the system is built in timber. It uses two modern methods of construction: a cross-laminated timber panel and a closed timber panel for the lower-rise houses. Triple glazing, mechanical ventilation and heat recovery, and as I mentioned, heat pumps. We offered, so although the scheme is based on a small number of repeating dwelling shells, effectively, residents who were involved from the outset got directly involved in the customization of their homes. So within a given volume, you could have a different number of bedrooms, different internal layouts in terms of more or less open plan, and different external finishing choices. And the range of unit types and sizes was sort of concealed in a terrace, you know, very kind of vernacular Cambridge style brick terrace, which meant that actually you did have 1-bed ground floor flats next to 5-bed townhouses, and it was all quite nicely mixed in and concealed. Common house is key to any co-housing group. It's where the community lives, in effect, comes together. This is the quite large common house at Cambridge, which basically dining hall, lounge, there's kids' playroom off to the left, etc. And pre-pandemic, incredibly well used by the residents. And at the centre of the scheme is a car-free lane, which provides fantastic safe space for play and neighbourly interaction, and complements the sort of large shared garden that is the other main piece of outside space. And that's partly achieved by keeping car parking at a low level into the edge of the site. Parking was provided at 1 space per dwelling, and there's currently a planning application going through to reduce that down to about 0.7, because members don't really have many cars. And you know, what is incredible when you go there now, obviously developer sort of finishes when it achieves practical completion, although one of our members of staff actually lives in Marmalade Lane, so we do get a good update on how it's going. But the process, as much as the buildings, are what build the community, and people feel a real sense of ownership and get to know their neighbours through that process. And it's a wonderful place for kids in particular. So I want to highlight, I think, 5 kind of learning points from it. I think the dividing line in UK housing, and in a way we sort of picked up on some commonalities, I suppose, in the culture in India on this as well, is between, if you like, what I would call speculative and purposive development. You know, most new housing is delivered speculatively, and you know, it's essentially delivered by a relatively small cabal of large organisations who have very, very weak competitive pressure and therefore no incentive to innovate. Whereas more purposive development, which is kind of long-term, you know, clearly driven by a mission, and that includes community-led housing. It isn't solely limited to it, but that's probably the main form, and co-housing is essentially a subset of community-led housing. The second is that the support of the local authority and or long-term institutions is important, mainly because they control land more than anything else. So obviously local authorities as planning authorities or highways authorities exert an influence, but the key thing is the ability to access land from organisations that should have a long-term perspective on their place. The third is that, you know, this was a developer-enabled scheme. One of the things that really unifies a lot of community-led housing projects in the UK is that they never get built, and one of the reasons is that doing it genuinely DIY is incredibly difficult and time-consuming. And while it has been done, so examples like Lilac in Leeds would be a good one. Generally, the melding of professional expertise and some sort of good rules around what makes good places is really important alongside community participation. It really needs to be a partnership. And then I think, just in terms of thinking about 2 points really to think about how we, you know, try and make this bigger. I mean, Marmalade Lane was a really nice size. It's relatively big as co-housing groups go. There's a concept called Dunbar's number, which some of you will be familiar with, which is essentially, it's the number of people within which essentially you can you can form meaningful community bonds, and essentially it tops out at about 100 to 120, and beyond that you're less likely to know you'll be able to form sort of stable neighbourly relationships with your neighbours, because there's just too many people to know. And the interesting thing about Marmalade Lane is, although it's not particularly dense at 42 dwellings per hectare, it could have been developed more densely for sure. The scale of a 1 hectare urban block is both a really good sort of spatial piece at which to grow a town or a city in a sensible, logical way with a good grid of legibility and so forth, and it also allows you to build communities and settlements that allow Dunbar's number of the number of people who can really form meaningful neighbourly bonds to thrive. So actually, if you're thinking about large-scale growth, and can get out of the world of just thinking about massive parcels of hundreds of dwellings at a time, and actually into how cities used to grow block by block and street by street, there's actually a really good affinity there. And then the last point is really around the challenge of scaling up innovation. Marmalade Lane was finished 3 years ago. There isn't another one yet. And so, although it's won loads of awards and is lauded, and you can go there and just see like what a wonderful life it gives the people who live there. Nobody's been rushing to do another one, and that's because fundamentally the UK is absolutely terrible at actually learning from exemplars and building on them, and because as I say, we have a supply side that is incredibly dominated by a small number, what economists call an oligopoly, small number of big players who have very little competitive pressure and therefore no incentive to innovate. So there is a thing about getting the regulatory regime right, and if you're trying to make a market, thinking about how that can result in more than one or two interesting but ultimately isolated examples. Thank you.
Well, Neil, that was great. And it did strike me looking at your pictures that what you had built was remarkably replicable, the sort of environment you can imagine masses of families in particular wanting to live in, the idea of the street surrounding the open space and the place not being dominated by cars, as is so common. And it did raise the question of how you get a perfectly sensible scheme, which is efficient and desirable in all sorts of standards, replicated. And this is where money perhaps comes in, and particularly the big money. And one of the biggest sources of money are organizations like the World Bank. So we're very pleased to hear from Atish, who works for a subsidiary of the World Bank. And I'm hoping you're going to say a little bit about yourself, as well as this wonderful scheme that you've explained to Richard and myself, that you've introduced working with banks to get them to pay for something different. So over to you, Atish.
Thank you, Nicholas, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone. As Nicholas said, I work for International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank Group. So you can say it's the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. So I'm an architect by training. I've been working on sustainability and energy efficiency of buildings throughout my career. And we started this program at the World Bank Group. We started this program on green buildings roughly about 10 years ago. Once we realized that buildings are such a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and also one of the most cost-efficient ways of reducing greenhouse gases. So let me jump into my presentation, and I can very quickly go through what we do and where we are working on green affordable homes. And maybe, as Nicholas pointed out, I can spend at the end about a few more minutes on the specific project that he mentioned. So as I mentioned, we are primarily dealing with the private sector. Sometimes we do work with government projects as well, but that's kind of a rarity. It's mostly through the private sector. Unfortunately, a lot of the development that's happening, especially on the lower income segment, is driven by the government. That's opening up now to private investment and private development. And that's where we are trying to help those private projects to go through. So stepping back on talking about India, I think the scale of the problem is pretty obvious to most of the people in this webinar, that we are at about 17% of the world's population, with roughly about 30% living in cities and growing. So roughly the entire state of the entire population of US is living in Indian cities right now, and that's going to almost double in the next couple of decades. And the government has already started working on the affordable housing shortage that's very apparent to everyone here by starting to construct about 10 million new homes. The target was 2020. I think that's going to be delayed a little bit, but it is very ambitious. And these homes, if these 10 million homes, out of which only 20% meet a certain green standard, we would be able to meet a huge difference. And just imagine if you're able to convert all of them to green, that would be fantastic. So these are just some numbers. I won't go into the individual numbers here, but if you convert that into something that's easily understandable, for every 4 green homes that are built, will save enough water to supply 1 additional home. For every 5 homes that are built, we would save enough energy to supply 1 additional home.
Can I just say, if you are intending to share slides at this moment, they're not showing.
I'm sorry. I apologize.
The panelists should remember that you have to press share screen.
Let me know if you can see my screen now with the slides.
Yes, that's visible.
You can see the slide which says environmental benefits of green homes.
We can indeed, yeah.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Nicholas, for pointing that out. So, there is also a significant health issue here, public health issue, as many of you have experienced or seen in pictures, that Indian cities are becoming increasingly polluted, especially with regards to air pollution. A lot of that does come from transport, but a huge amount comes from the energy that's needed to build buildings and to operate buildings. And if we can cut down some of that, there will obviously be not just climate change benefit, but also public health benefits. So the challenges that we see in India, and these are in some ways quite global as well, building green is, firstly, there is a lack of awareness of the end user benefits. So if you go out and talk to people, and some of that has been pointed out in earlier presentations, that people think this is not meant for the lower income or the middle income category. This is something that's very kind of upmarket. That myth has to be broken, and it has been in many projects. And the lack of technical know-how. This is not a very difficult challenge to overcome, actually, because as was shown in Girish's presentation, none of these technologies are kind of rocket science. These are easily available. A lot of them have been handed over through our vernacular architecture. So building green is not complex, and in many cases not very costly as well if you plan it well in advance. And of course, the solutions may vary from one place to the other, depending on the context, whether you have a dense urban settlement or an open land where you can build a sprawling single-story building. Then the last aspect is lack of green finance. Green finance has been available for bigger projects, more like larger scale projects, even infrastructure projects. But for green affordable homes, in the past has been limited, but thankfully that has been changing and changing fast. There's a lot of green finance available. In fact, now the problem has reversed, that there is more finance available, green finance available, than there are takers. And takers have to meet certain criteria. It's not like any project that claims to be green can access that. It has to be at scale. Obviously, the investors look at large scale investments, and it has to meet certain verifiable standards that can be trusted. So those are 2 very important criteria. that projects should be looking at. So with that in mind, we came up with our program roughly about 7-8 years ago, which combined both investments. So we invest sometimes directly with building developers, and we've done a few of those in India as well with low-income affordable housing projects. We sometimes invest with banks, with local banks or housing finance companies, and help them in an advisory capacity to develop green building products, like green mortgages, for example, that can help their customers borrow money for their green projects. So I'll share one of the examples later here. Sometimes if we get a chance, we also work on green building codes and policies. So we have so far helped 6 countries develop the green building codes. India is not one of those. India already had an energy efficiency code before we started the program here. But we've been working a little bit on the incentive side as well. However, I do personally feel that incentives are a stopgap solution. They cannot be sustained for a very long time. If the market really understands the benefit of green and does it even with or without incentives, I think that's when we would have really passed a threshold which would kickstart upstreaming or mass scaling of this. Then the last part of this is our certification, a standard that we have developed globally called EDGE for green buildings, with the primary intent to connect it to investments. Now, not every EDGE project gets IFC investment, and not every IFC investment gets an EDGE certificate. But it is something that we have developed because we found a gap in the market for something that was fairly straightforward, focused, and yet comprehensive and ambitious enough to change the market and change the path that we are taking towards climate change. So the first issue was, what really is a green building? How do you define it? So rather than go into a complicated matrix, we said, if you can firstly reduce your resource efficiency by at least 20%, by resource efficiency, I mean energy, water, and material usage by 20%, that's the quantitative aspect of it. Then it has to be verified by an independent third party. Now, this is very important if the project is looking for investments. And thirdly, it should have quantified impact reporting, which should also include impact on GHG emissions. So all of that is extremely important, and we have developed this in our own system as well. So with the EDGE standard, we have 20% improvement on water usage in the building as compared to the local baseline, 20% lower energy usage as compared to local baseline, and 20% lower embodied energy of construction materials used in the building, again, as compared to the local baseline. So that's our global standard. Anywhere you go, this same standard applies. It's just the baseline that changes from one building to the other, one location to the other, or one country to the other. And then to make it easily accessible, to kind of break that barrier between engineers and consultants and developers and building owners, we've created a free software, free online software at edgebuildings.com, where the entire, all the cities that we are working in, all the building types that we're working in, all the data is in there. All you need to do is just enter your location, your building type, and a few basic questions on the size and the geometry of the building. And it develops a baseline for you, a unique baseline for your project based on the prevalent practices in your region for that building type, and allows you to improve on your baseline. So for example, here, what you're seeing is a screenshot of a typical project where you're seeing the baseline is this much energy consumption. And by selecting a few different measures, there is a whole list beyond this as well, which goes right from passive design down to renewable energy. So you can choose different measures, and it gives you instant feedback on the cost reduction, or the operational cost reduction, and the incremental cost per housing unit, and the payback in years. So you can actually play around with the measures and choose the one that really fits your needs, your aesthetic requirements, and availability, etc. The target, as I said, is 20%. So here, if this number is 20% or more, then you meet the energy standard. And similarly, you have to meet the water and material standard as well. One interesting point here, what you see here, which may not be very clear, is virtual energy for comfort. Now, this is a challenge in affordable housing because the operational cost of these homes is not really very high to start with, because most of them don't use air conditioning. They may not have a lot of appliances. They may have a little bit of light, but that's only used during the after the sunset hours. So it's very hard to make a case for green buildings just based on operational cost saving. It has to include the thermal comfort, the improved living standard, the quality of life inside the homes. And it is sometimes hard to quantify that. So the way we have dealt with it is come up with this calculation for virtual energy for comfort. So this is saying that this is the additional amount of energy that would be needed in this non-air conditioned house to make it comfortable. So just in case in the future, if somebody installs an air conditioning, this is the additional amount of energy they would be using. So a lower virtual energy means a more comfortable house. If you completely go down to zero, that means no air conditioning, no mechanical cooling is needed in that house anymore. So we've tried to overcome that challenge through this method. So you're most welcome to go to our website, edgebuildings.com, register for free and try it out. There is no charge for the usage of the software. And as I said, it encompasses every single country in the world. And in India, we have about 65 different locations. And for each location, you can select a different income category and just plug in your project details and analyze it. Once the project goes through the entire evaluation and analysis and auditing at two different stages, at the post-design stage and at the post-construction stage, then it is awarded with these certificates. Being a financial institution, we have aligned our certification very closely with these international green finance standards with the intent of facilitating ease of green finance access to them. So even if IFC is not investing in that project, we want the projects that are going for green to get investment from one of these or other green investment opportunities that are out there right now. Now, the other aspect of working on this is working with banks, with housing finance companies and banks who are investing in local products and who are giving finance to home buyers. So what is the case for them? Again, that was a challenge. Initially, they were extremely reluctant to look at this segment. The case that we make to them is, firstly, it's a reduced default risk. If they invest in green homes, there is data to show that the default rate really goes down because people are saving money. They are saving operational costs, so they have more money left in the pocket to pay back the bank. Then there is reduced asset risk because these are less prone to temperature changes. Then there is this huge opportunity that is now available, especially with regards to green finance being available internationally, and it is a growing market, especially in India. So with that, those four aspects, we've been able to convince several local banks and financial institutions to work with us. And the way we work with them is, firstly, on the investment side, we provide them, so actually before the investment comes, we provide them advisory on how to structure their green products. We provide them training on green buildings, on how to actually evaluate. In fact, they don't have to evaluate. It's the certification, which is already doing the evaluation, the assessment, that they just have to accept. But still, they need to know how to actually quantify the impact, how to report it if they're looking for external finance. So we do provide some training on that. and how to convince the clients as well, their clients. We work on the market creation. So through our EDGE certification, so far we've already certified roughly about 3 million square meters or 30 million square feet of space in India. And our plans are to substantially increase that in the coming years. And then we do provide investments in different formats. As I said, not all certified projects get invested in, but it is certainly one of the criteria. There are a couple of examples here. This is in Colombia, one of their bigger housing finance companies, Bank Colombia. We work with them on this the same format that I just talked to you about by firstly building the client capacity, raising awareness in the market, and then the capacity of the staff. And it has really shot through the roof. It's gone through the roof. Within a span of 4 or 5 years, the number of projects that have been certified, the number of homes has gone from 0 to about 13,000, and more than 1.2 million square meters of their portfolio has been certified. And they ended up issuing a green bond as well, where IFC has also invested. Now, this is a completely different example, and this is the one that Nicholas was mentioning. We are working with a local housing finance company in India called Avas. So they are primarily lending money to beneficiary-led construction, meaning people who want to build their own houses in north and western parts of India. And they are quite keen on making at least a part of their portfolio to be green. So this is a very difficult market because these are individuals, some of whom may not have a proper understanding or awareness of green. So a lot of work has to be done on that front. Plus the whole regular green building certification that works very well with developers and corporations doesn't really work at that scale. So we are trying to come up with a simpler system, working through the bank, training their people, and coming up with a simplified version of the EDGE software that you just saw, something that's very, very basic. That is, when somebody comes to the bank to apply for a loan, they're given some options right away, saying that, okay, these are some of the green packages or green bundles that you can choose. And each of those green bundles would save them at least 20% on energy, water, materials. They would be provided the cost and the benefit of those green bundles immediately. And there will be a pitch made to them that this will also make your house more comfortable and also make your house more resilient, because power shortage, water cuts are not uncommon in many of those areas that they cover. So you can be more resilient to those kind of situations by having a greener home where you can maybe produce your own electricity, maybe save rainwater for harvesting, maybe reduce your demand for energy and water. So by making that case, we are convincing them. In fact, the bank is convincing their clients. And once they agree, the bank agrees to invest that extra amount, if there is an extra amount needed to make that house green, and kind of bundles it, puts it in the whole package of the loan that they're providing. And then the bank officers, the engineers, are being trained to support them on the ground as well.
Atif, I hate to say it, but I think we're running out of time. Are you getting to the end?
Yeah, I'll just finish in 2 minutes then. So we've been working with different banks and financial institutions here and trying out different approaches, investing directly, and these kind of advisory solutions are also really exciting because this is a market that was not really tapped in before. We have in the past also tried to work on bringing some of the top housing, affordable housing developers and create awareness and work with manufacturers to try to reduce the cost of some of those materials as well. These are some of the projects that we have certified through our EDGE system. You can see that they've all saved more than 20% on energy, water, and material through very simple solutions that are market ready. None of them have cost too much. The usual payback is roughly about 1 to 2 years. And that's about it. So we are open to scaling this up. And I think it's high time we did that. And for that, we need cooperation and collaboration between all the stakeholders. So I'll stop there, and thanks again for the opportunity.
Fine, thanks so much. There's an awful lot to think about in your presentation, and I hope we'll discuss it later. But now I want to bring in the final part of this session, Brian and Camilla, to talk about how to make sure the housing is in the right place, because all the good work could otherwise be wasted if you built in the middle of nowhere.
Right, I'm Camilla. I'm going to do the first half and then I'll hand over to Brian. And I'm just waiting to get our screen share working. I think John is doing that for us. As soon as they're up, I'll start. So, excellent, good, great, thank you very much. So I'm going to explain a little bit about the comparative costs of perhaps building new as opposed to using and modifying existing. So I'm working with Brian Love, we are sort of promoting the idea of the connected cities, which Brian will sort of outline in more detail. I'm just going to talk initially about the sort of comparison of sort of old versus new. Next, please. John, perhaps you can tell me. I don't think I can advance the slides myself, can I? Think not. Anyway, I mean, the context of all of this is that we are in a climate emergency. Yeah, we can stick with that slide for the moment. Thanks. And, you know, it will be well known to all of you that we are seeing some of the hottest temperatures that we've seen for, I mean, in our living time, but also in thousands of years. So it's actually quite a serious situation. It's a very serious situation. And on top of that, particularly, I think the water shortage issue is a very serious issue, particularly in Chennai, which, for example, in 2019, had to declare a sort of day zero, which was when they ran out of water because the monsoon was late. So monsoons, the result of climate change is that monsoon is unpredictable, and therefore how we think about water storage and our water rationing in future is going to be a critical aspect of going forward. Next, please. And I think this is perhaps quite important because for a long time, I think the perception has been that climate change has been predominantly about industry, but it has been well known for a long, long time that transportation is responsible for a significant amount of carbon dioxide emissions. But in reality, also alongside that, building materials are hugely destructive in terms of emissions. And concrete is probably one of the worst, and glass is obviously very high energy consumption in its manufacture. So we need to think about new materials. So it's wonderful to see examples that are actually exploring the new materials that can do probably a better job for a much lower carbon footprint. Next, please. Also, how we travel is really important. So this is kind of when you build, people have to be able to get to the house. They have to be able to get from their house to where they're going to work and where they're going to access amenity. So typically what's happening, we're seeing much too much of in Britain, is that we're building in places that has no public transport. Therefore, the new people who move in are going to be entirely reliant on cars. And so the carbon emissions of the mode of transport you use varies massively, and it shows very clearly that large cars are the worst and rail is by far the best. aviation is a sort of slightly bracketed thing in that it is bad, but you have to remember that probably the number of journeys by air is low compared to the number of journeys by large car, for example. But there is the opportunity, particularly within regions, to rely entirely on rail in the future and not on air travel. So within large countries, even within small countries like Britain, there was I think the Campaign for Better Transport had a report and a plea to government to actually try and curb air travel within the UK, so domestic air travel, which is very rarely necessary, perhaps just to islands. Next, please. And there is another aspect too, which is actually how much space it takes to move people. And this was a study that was done, gosh, now I've forgotten, brain freeze, but European city studied the actual space that's needed to move people. And it's very clear that you can move far more people by rail or by bus than you can in individual cars. So individual cars take an enormous amount of space, which then contribute to congestion, clutter, destruction of physical amenity, and actually the roads to provide them, motorways, take up masses of good land that could be turned over to agriculture to support growing populations and provide food for cities. Next, please. So we've done a few sort of costs on the comparative costs of new rail versus existing rail, so upgrading what exists. And we have deliberately not expressed them in the same currencies because we feel that probably it's better for our Indian colleagues to understand it in terms of their currency. In the UK, you can see a huge difference between new rail, which is something like 60 million per kilometre, as opposed to upgrading rail, which could be somewhere between 8 and 30 million per kilometre, so significantly cheaper. Next, please. So next, please. Some examples that have actually upgraded existing rail infrastructure. Very good example is the Manchester Metro Link, which I think probably was implemented 10, 15 years ago. It's been hugely successful in terms of adaptive change and mode transfer to public transport away from cars. But it used existing rail. So this particular picture was the first phase, which actually used different cars from later phases. But so its cost per kilometre was 7.5 million roughly per kilometre, which is really relatively cheap. So it was about upgrading, obviously, the existing rail, the signalling, upgrading stations particularly have to be upgraded usually from, well, certainly in the UK, to be disabled access and so on. So that is a big cost, is actually probably upgrading the stations may be one of the highest costs. Next, please. For example, so on the Manchester Metro Link, phase 2 was a spur to take it out to the airport, which of course is an essential really of any modern airport, should have a fixed link to the city centre. And this was built, but you can see the cost was significantly higher because it was all new build. So it came out at more like 26 million. Next,
Camilla, you should be wrapping up now, I'm afraid.
I'm nearly done. I'll be handing over to Brian in a second. The London Overground is another exemplary example. London was riddled with old railway lines that were, some were quite historic and old. By connecting them together and creating an orbital system, it actually fulfilled the need for sort of sideways journeys, if you like, rather than radial journeys into the centre. And it was just infinitely more successful than ever was planned or even anticipated. It filled up and it met its sort of peak capacity within about 3 months of opening. So it was fulfilling, but it was very cheap to produce. It produced at the cost of, 1.2 million per kilometre, very cheap. So even though new stations had to be put in. Next, please. I think now I'm going to, so this is an example also from India, out of interest as well, which was the double tracking and electrification of an existing railway. So I won't even try and pronounce it because I'll probably fall over, but and the cost here, it's expressed in rupees, but 7.4 crore per kilometre. So probably more expensive than UK, simply because, obviously the difference between twin tracking and double tracking, single tracking to twin tracking is already doubling the railway infrastructure and then upgrading. Nonetheless, it can be done and it's worth doing without a question. And I'll hand over, I think, to Brian. Next, please. There was one more example from Chandigarh as well, where actually looking at building new versus using existing was considered, and it was considerably cheaper to use existing. Next, please. Okay. So I'll hand over to Q now, to Brian, excuse me.
To Q. Okay, thanks very much. Yes, next slide, please. Connected Cities focuses on making maximum use of the existing rail infrastructure to minimise carbon footprint. And we propose groups of towns gathering together to decide where to locate their transport and development. Next slide, please. The focus is in the 1 kilometres around railway stations, whether existing or new, which in broad calculated terms can accommodate a population of 30,000. Next slide, please. Applying this system to Bristol, these are the existing stations, and looking at the 1 kilometre circles around them, we believe that you could accommodate a population of 57,000 additional people within that. Next slide, please. There are proposals to develop new railway stations in Bristol, or quite well advanced, and reopen some of the existing lines that are currently only used for freight. The potential of the new railway stations, which are currently proposed, would house approximately another 24,000 people, in addition to those who are already in that area. So that we're looking at about 80,000 potentially within walking distance of a railway station, good level of service. Next slide, please. The area to the west of Bristol constitutes a little connected city of its own, in the sense that all travel would be within 15 minutes of the hub town, which in this instance would be Avonmouth itself. This is currently a port area and has very substantial development population potential. We believe that it could easily accommodate 75,000 people in both the existing and the new stations there. It would require some upgrading of the rail system, but again, that's already underway. Next slide, please. Because Bristol Metro West is part of a general programme throughout all of Bristol to improve public transport dramatically, to integrate it so that the trains, the buses, any light rail that's proposed, etc., all work together with a common ticketing system to a common timetable, and they're integrated. This is the plan as shown on the right-hand side. We're already talking about Metro West Phase 1, which will be 2 new stations, Metro West Phase 2, which is a bit further down the line, but still well underway, that will have 3. Now, if you put all of these stations together, both Avonmouth and those in Greater Bristol, the potential population that could be provided for within walking distance of a railway station would be in the order of 150 to 160,000 additional people. At present, the government housing target is, well, it's actually 2,500 dwellings, which is around about 7,000 persons per annum. So that shows you that even with just the existing stuff in the pipeline, there's nearly 25 years of capacity there. That would prevent the growth of development on places that are not well served by public transport, because as Camilla pointed out, there is an enormous difference between the impact that you have when you build with public transport and the impact you have when you force people to use cars. Next slide, please. Same thing applies to Tirunelveli. So at present there are 7 railway stations in the area, and they have relatively limited services. Numbers per day are quite low. Next slide, please. The existing stations could accommodate in the order of 165,000. A lot depends on densities, but there's certainly capacity there. Next slide, please. An example of such a station, using the kind of diagram for ensuring that there's green wedges coming in and that 50% of the land is left free for green purposes within this 1 kilometre circle. This is an existing station called Pekai, which is to the west. And it will have a high density core, but primarily the housing will be accommodated in a series of villages. And you can see here the blue and green infrastructure that is proposed. Next slide, please. Tirunelveli Connected City, if you were to develop a series of 8 new stations in addition to the existing one, could accommodate very substantial numbers of people. Indian densities are considerably higher than those in the UK. It's perfectly normal to live at densities which are unusual in the North UK. There could easily be a further 500,000 people accommodated within walking distance of rail services in this. That would obviously take time, but at present there's an enormous upgrade going on with the existing rail system, as we have seen. It's double tracking, it's being electrified, both of which are key. And what needs to be done to make all this happen is to introduce new and effective signalling systems, which are developing very fast and being used throughout all of Europe and spreading across the world. All this technology is coming along quickly. It could be well employed. Next slide, please. So if you'd like to know more about this, this is our website. If you want to find it, just type Connected Cities as all one word into the Google, and we will bounce out at the top. So if you're interested in following up more detail of this, that's where to find it. Over to you, Nick. Nick?
Nick seems silent for a moment.
Right, okay, that's a first. Right, so Richard.
It's my task to pick up any questions for this session. So while Nick's recovering his connection, I'll do that. First of all, thank you very much to the speakers, all absolutely fascinating and highly relevant, I think. If I could ask the speakers to put their cameras back on, please. Teef, thank you very much. And Neil, if you're still there. Because I was going to direct the first question to Neil. We have a question about clarifying the difference between co-housing and co-living, Neil. I think you'd be the person to do that.
Yeah, I sent a shirty letter to the Architects Journal about this a few years ago. I think co-living is something that sprung up to provide what I would describe as professional halls of residence in places like London and Manchester, which tend to be, you get a small, studio or 1-bed flat, and then a bunch of shared kind of spaces like workspace or games rooms or whatever, which kind of compensate for your lack of a basic element of sort of normal standard private space to live in. And whereas co-housing is all about everybody having a kind of normal private dwelling and the shared facilities really being a kind of an additional thing. Now, there's better and less good co-living, and I actually think co-living works fine when you put it in, a really high density location. I mean, if you're in a co-living block, next to Hyde Park, and you've got amazing restaurants and facilities and amenity space on your doorstep. Really, is it a problem that you haven't got, say, 37 square meters of space to live in? Not really. But if you stick it, out in zone 5 of London, miles away from any real amenities, I mean, that's just kind of exploitative, really. So, it's horses for courses. So it is legitimate, I think, co-living, but it's not co-housing. And likewise with co-housing, there's a debate about whether, particularly with the desire to make this kind of thing much more common and viable, whether the model that basically says, everybody gets a wonderful house and then some things over and above, how do you make that affordable, and who pays for it? So, I think there is a legitimate discussion to look at whether some elements of co-housing would be about kind of pooling some of the things that you might, ordinarily have. But that said, co-housing is pretty efficient on that already. You don't, people share bike stores and tool storage and things like that. And, they tend not to garages and so forth. So, it's already a pretty kind of responsible mode of development. But yeah, I mean, hopefully that captures the essence. They're not at all the same. And it's very unfortunate that I think that they do get conflated from time to time.
Thank you. Atif, I wanted to pick up something that's been running through the chat, which is about the scale and locality of funding. So in the UK, we used to have very local building societies. So just just dealing with housing in one town, but they've all more or less been swallowed up by larger banks and building societies at more of a national scale. As I think Neil, was it Neil who pointed out, or Stephen? No, Stephen, there are a number of kind of new innovative community-led funders here. I'm just wondering what your experience is, having worked across the world, about whether there's a right scale for providing funding for green homes, or whether it's much more to do with how financial institutions work in each country.
I think what you described in UK is somewhat true here in India as well. Most of the funding now for these homes is coming from these large banks or housing finance institutions, and a lot of new players have been coming into the market as well. Initially, there were just a couple of them. Now that we have dozens of them around the country. I personally have not worked with any community-funded project as part of the work that I'm doing right now. So I won't be able to share any experience on that, but I see actually even some small players in the market are showing a lot of interest in sustainability. That's very encouraging, and they're open to trying out different ways of investing and trying to help their customers.
Thank you. We've got 1 minute, Neil. I don't know if you have experience of whether it's the larger or smaller funders that are happier to work on the green housing.
I think as it becomes more mainstream, it's just going to have to be, we've not had an issue with larger funders refusing to fund things, but actually we don't tend to work with them anyway because they don't like, unusual items like us. So yeah. We've used Homes England's Home Building Fund for projects, and we're working with some of the organisations listed by Stephen Dale in his comments in the chat about funding other projects. But it's going to have to change, isn't it? I mean, we're in the weird situation in the UK where, particularly kind of post-Grenfell, there's this kind of incredible mix-up about whether timber buildings are okay or not, or whether it's above or below a certain height. But the reality is that if we're going to get to a sort of any kind of systemic net zero approach in the UK, we're going to be building houses out of timber as standards, in the future. That's just the way it's going to have to go, or we won't be challenging it at all. So I think a lot of it is, do lenders want the business in the sector? And at the moment, some don't seem all that bothered. But once we hopefully return to a slightly more normal, market, you would expect it to be, to become a lot more standardized. I say that obviously, again, most most housing is delivered. The big house builders don't basically use bank debt; they do it all off their balance sheets, and they are incredibly resistant to the idea of moving away from building in brick and block. And you can see the way that the Future Homes Task Force in the UK is quietly coming around to the idea that the Future Home Standard really is nothing more than putting in heat pumps instead of gas boilers, and otherwise carry on as you were before. So I think that it's a really challenging one, but I don't see finance really as the biggest obstacle facing these projects. I think it's much more about it's about land, and it's about I think, again, alluded to in the chat, it's about how you deal with the bits that you need to deal with to get to the point where you've got a fundable project, which is basically the planning costs and and all the legals associated with it. So things like the kind of community housing fund, I think, are really key, and I'm sure that translates equally across to other countries as well. Where how do you get the financial capital up front into people wanting to deliver their own projects without a big kind of capital base of their own, I think is a real challenge.
Thank you very much. That's actually really interesting in the context of what Atif said about the fact that actually there is more green finance than there is demand for it now, which is fascinating. I wasn't aware of that at a global level, but it may be that the question I was asking about whether the funding is there is not really the issue now. The issue is much more the questions I was raising in the first part about whether landowners and developers and consumers are with us. Consumers, I think, are coming. So maybe there's a kind of hard knot of people in the industry who are reluctant to change their ways. We might come back to this later on, but we actually have to move on. Nick, are you back with us?
Yeah. So that was a great session, and I'm only sorry the technology has worked well, but time, unfortunately, is a minute takes a minute in India as well as in the UK. So we're on to the final session now. I'm afraid we're going to have to cancel the break, and I'm going to be shortly asking Paul Smith, who's the Chief Executive of the Elim Housing Association in Bristol, to say something about what sort of innovative projects are underway there. Paul Smith was formerly the Cabinet Member for Housing, so has had a background in the local authority as well as running a housing association. And it does seem to me that the issue we're raising of scaling up is about turning alternatives into mainstream, and that probably is going to require specialized developers who focus on applying both affordable and sustainable principles at the same time, and somehow getting hold of the land. So I'm going to ask Paul to tell us a little bit more about his experience and how he sees the future. So Paul, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Nick. I'm just trying to work out how to share my screen. Okay, is that on for everyone? Hello?
Not yet, Paul, I think. Is it PowerPoint you're trying to share?
Yeah, I can see it on my screen. But...
is PowerPoint in slideshow?
Yes.
Yes. So click the green share screen at the bottom center of your Zoom window.
I did that.
And then pick the PowerPoint from the option provided. And then there's a share button in blue, bottom right.
Oh, right. Is that blue? Right. Yeah. That should work now then. Have you got that?
Yes, not in slide. It's not in slideshow. You might want to go back and. But we can do that, I think.
Okay, that should be slideshow now. Yeah,
that's fine. Thank you. Yep.
Yeah. So, as Nick said, I'm a poacher or a gamekeeper turned poacher. I'm now chief exec of Elim Housing Association, which in British terms is a small association. You see our geography on that screen. We've only got about 900 homes, about 500 of which are classed as general needs. 250 are supported homes for people who've experienced homelessness, and 150 are pitches for gypsy and travellers. So though we're small, we're actually the biggest provider of gypsy and traveller accommodation in the country. what I'm going to call on to a certain extent is my experience at the council as well. And here is, in terms of setting the scene, and I know some people have mentioned Bristol already, here is Bristol. Now, there seem to be two ways of calculating the population, both of which are wrong. One is the population within Bristol's municipal boundary. And then the other, which is used by the centre of cities, is Bristol and South Gloucestershire. But not all of South Gloucestershire is really part of the city of Bristol. So the reality is somewhere between these figures. But Bristol's population is 465,000, or on the other measure, nearly 750. In Bristol itself, there are 202,000 homes, and in South Gloucester, 323. There are actually far more sites and land available in South Gloucestershire than there is in Bristol, because it is the outskirts of the city and the surrounding countryside, but a lot of that countryside is protected through planning through one way or another. In terms of the provision of social housing, in Bristol there's about 40,000 homes, and then another 13,000 in South Gloucestershire. Bristol performs economically fairly well in terms of the country as a whole. And if you consider that these GB stats are slightly skewed because they include London, which is almost like a country within the country, Bristol's got a much higher proportion of professional, technical, scientific, almost double the national average of people working in finance, in insurance, and only sort of half the level nationally of people working in manufacturing. It's got a higher degree level than across the country as a whole, and average incomes are also slightly higher. I think if you took London out of that equation, you would see Bristol being significantly higher than the rest of the country excluding London. In 2016, Marvin Rees was elected as the mayor with a pledge to build 2,000 homes a year. Bristol had been bouncing around about 1,200 a year before then. And one of the sort of innovations of Marvin's administration was to create a one city plan, which aimed to pull together the resources of all of the players within the city so that they could align their strategies, so that they weren't producing plans both in the public and private and voluntary sectors that were in opposition with each other or which were phased incorrectly. So it's a plan to 2050. We're into year 5 of that plan, so it's still maturing. It's quite young as a concept. But within that was obviously the intention to increase the number of homes based partly on population projections, which show that the population of the area will also grow fairly significantly in that period. And it's, you know, if you don't provide the housing, then we'll see house prices rise further, rents rise further, and that sort of issue where it becomes unaffordable and the city sort of collapses under its own weight. And to a certain extent, that was what is already happening. The plan is founded on the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure everybody here is fairly familiar with. I think, you know, pick out particularly number 11, that, you know, we have sustainable cities and communities. Now, my responsibility within the council was for housing, and which included housing delivery as well as looking after the council's own homes and regulation of the private rented sector. And it was clear to me fairly early on, probably even before I started, that I had 3 main levers that I could pull as a municipal leader in terms of trying to deliver more homes. And they were land, money, and planning. And in that order, you can have fantastic planning policies, but if you've got no land, it's fairly meaningless. And also, you know, the money is not much use without the land. You can obviously use the money to buy land, but in Bristol, the council owns 50% of the land, along with the rest of the public sector. And therefore, the issue isn't about how do you buy it, but how do you bring it into use and make good use of it. So in terms of looking at housing associations and community-led organisations, firstly, we made public sector land available to them. Secondly, we made grants available to them, because certainly social housing does not work just on loan finance, it needs grant support. And then thirdly, we looked at how we could change our planning rules to actually support the ambitions around new home building. And what I want to do next is just run through two estates with two very different examples of ways in which we've tried to make a difference. And the important thing I'd say about these estates, we often talk about what is a sustainable location. Well, the most sustainable locations are the ones you've already got. And the most important places you've got are sustaining the places that you've already got, environmentally as well as socially. And we should really make the most of our existing communities, as with any other resources, when we're talking about sustainability, before creating new ones. So if we take the first community and looking at two projects here, the first one is a community-led project called We Can Make, working with an organisation called Agile Homes, which came up with something which they called urban acupuncture, which was looking at the very low density developments. This estate was built in the 30s, but it's also true of estates built in the 1950s as well. Very low densities, which over time have undermined local economies, because it's much more difficult for shops and pubs and community organisations and faith organisations to survive if there isn't a density of population there. And so what this project is about is looking at those spaces and coming up with a design code which allows you then to utilise them. And that land is interesting because the land is, half of the land there is still council, half of it's private. A lot of the sites will be mixed ownership, but the council certainly said we will put up our land to make this scheme work. The first, you can see a sort of demonstration house in the middle of the slide, but the first projects have been gone through planning now to start building between existing homes at the end of existing rows. The University of West of England identified, I think, over 1,400 potential plots within an existing estate of about 3,000 homes. So I think there's another thing in terms of regeneration. Often when regeneration these days is seen as taking an existing area, knocking it down and then building something new, which again is socially and environmentally unsustainable. Whereas what this does is it doesn't require any existing homes to be demolished or any existing populations to move. And in fact, it does allow families to relocate back with each other. So that project's working. It's got an ambition of building 50 homes a year once it gets fully up and running. In the same estate, you've got a sort of more corporate example of how building sustainable homes is being delivered at a scale. One site, again in the ownership of the council, was not very easy to develop. A brownfield site with a stream running through it. It required money from Homes England to support the development and dealing with the site. It also required the council obviously to put the land up, and also in this deal it says 30% on this side. It's actually increased to 46% more recently. 46% of the homes will be sold back to the council for council housing. The other 54% are sold on the open market, very much targeted at households with incomes between £15,000 and £35,000 a year. And the thing about Bocklock's model, which was developed in Scandinavia, and they've already provided over 10,000 homes in Scandinavia, is that they're looking at how can they provide homes which are affordable to buy to families on modest and reasonable incomes, the sort of incomes that people might find in the public sector for example, for nurses or firefighters or police officers, a whole range of sort of standard roles. And also within that, it's about building a community, not individual homes. So quite a lot of effort and energy went into actually consulting the people who live nearby around what sort of community facilities might be needed. How do you landscape? How do you make the most of the stream? That I grew up on an estate built in the 50s, and what they did with most of the streams on the estate I grew up on was they culverted them. And so they lost actually quite a lot in terms of that natural environment. I'm going to move on to another estate now, and again looking at two initiatives, one at a more micro scale and one at a larger scale. This estate is called Lochleys. It's in the north of Bristol, actually next to a railway line, and I think there is an opportunity to put a station in that area, relating back to a previous presentation. Now, there was a sort of a community type organisation which came up with something it called the Snag Home, which is actually a one-bedroom house. It was part of a challenge from many years ago to, you know, could you build a house for £60,000? And the whole thing about the snug houses is it's incredibly sustainable environmentally. It can be used to put again into smaller sites, or it can be built at scale. I visited the first one that was completed last year, which was actually built in someone's back garden and used for housing a refugee by the homeowner of the main house. But now Ecomotive, who build the snug, have been commissioned by the council in Bristol to build some council housing on a site again owned by the council. Again, on the same estate, a corporate approach with providing housing at scale. This is Legal & General's scheme, which is actually next to the railway line and along a cycle path, which will provide 185 homes, all timber construction on the council land, 50% then sold back to the council as social housing, and the other 50% as housing in the general market. So I hope that those give, you know, in the short time available, some examples of how you can both have a community approach and a corporate approach to meeting housing needs in a sustainable way. I think there are some, you know, in summary, some key takeaways I would have. Firstly, the importance of partnership working between the council, housing associations, private developers, community-led housing organisations, of which in Bristol there's a multiplicity of. As I say, the council makes land available to them and grants. Access to public land, you know, where possible for free, because then that creates some of the subsidy that's required to make schemes stack up financially, and it requires councils to think about the wider benefits rather than just the financial benefit of land disposal. Grant funding for the social housing elements, ensuring that there are strong links to existing communities and services, and how new development can actually strengthen those communities and services. The use, obviously, is sustainable materials, which is usually timber, but in the case of the first scheme I showed you, that was compressed straw bales with a timber frame. With all of these examples, the housing is built off-site, and that allows the opportunity to build at scale and to provide a uniform quality to the housing, and also that commitment to the environment around the homes and not just the homes themselves. I think what we've all found during lockdown is it's the places between our homes and around our homes that are so important to us, not just the homes themselves. And that concludes my presentation.
Paul, thank you for bringing in some really interesting examples and lessons, which I'm sure, even though the context can be so different, many of the lessons must apply in both our countries. Now, I've asked Jitesh and Vimal, who've been working with us to deal with the issue of conflicting interests and how one can begin to get agreement so we could indeed scale up the kinds of ideas we've been talking about today. So are you ready to come in?
Yeah, thank you, Nick. I'll just share my screen. Hope you can see my screen and you can hear me.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
Good.
Over to you, Jitesh.
Yeah. So thank you, everyone. I think we just flowing very naturally from what Paul just explained. So I'll just go to the next slide, give a bit of introduction of ourselves. So I'm a bit of hybrid between Bristol and India, and have worked in the same sort of cities as well in past. I stayed, and I was calling Bristol my home for 7 years. I'm an architect by background, and sustainable design has been part of my whole career. I started my career with the world's first LEED platinum building outside the US called Green Business Center in Hyderabad, and that's been going on for a long time now. Over to you, Vimal.
Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Vimal, based in Hong Kong, so hello from Hong Kong. I'm a structural engineer and currently work as an associate with Bureau Happold Hong Kong. I'm very passionate about applying engineering and technology to create better living outcomes for the society. And the flavor of for my past 2 months had been working closely with other engineers and other engineering streams to design net zero office towers in Hong Kong. I'm also part of the C-Lab at Bureau Happold, where C-Lab is a platform where we young professionals are given opportunity to apply our knowledge and skills to influence real change in the communities. And I really want to do this for building the sustainable societies in India. And we are going to talk more about it in our presentation. So a little bit about the collaboration we had been doing with URBED and SCAD over almost a year now. So we collaborated on a Center for Sustainability, which SCAD is currently working on. It's basically a small organization and also a physical infrastructure building to develop a Center for Sustainability. What we did with SCAD and other stakeholders is run a design sprint with them so that it helps them in prioritizing their objectives, what they want to achieve through the center, and also prioritize the activities they want to take up through the center, which activities should be done first and which activities should be done later, and so on. SCAD has started working on various activities of the center, and what's coming next is Bureau Happold and I working with them to structure some of the courses which are focused on sustainability, and also help them in designing the energy efficient features for the existing houses or even the new houses they are going to build, and also some courses around the construction materials. Like so far, many of the speakers have covered that how it's important to focus on the innovation in construction materials, and it's going to be an important aspect. The other collaboration was focused on the Eco House, where we basically collaborated and contributed to various workshops, which happened after the prototype was built. And it was focused on discussing some of the user feedback and also some of the engineering features it has. We also plan to work with SCAD in basically scaling up this model for their own campus, which is right now on hold due to COVID, but it will be coming soon and probably next year or year after that. And we want to look at how to scale this up further on eco-village level, or even developing the sustainable transit-oriented development. So the question is, how can we do that, and how we can get all the stakeholders interested in it? So what we need is basically, like for any other sustainability focused projects, we need to have a balance in these three factors, which is economic factors, then the environmental aspects, and also the social aspects. The the whole business case becomes a business case only when the economy of it is going to work out, when people are going to achieve the profits they need to achieve to run the businesses. Also, when people get the houses they desire, and also the product is properly placed in the market, and at the same time it achieves the sustainability targets as well, that country, that association, or even what we should be aspiring for. So has this done before? And you have seen so many case studies have been discussed in this conference, and few more Jitesh is going to talk about.
I think, again, as I said, it will flow directly from what Paul has just mentioned. It's very important for a project to be viable. The land is made available, or grant is made available, and I think this is what I'm going to talk into the two case studies. This is the one that we are currently working with a couple of clients in Bath, and we're developing this affordable residential scheme where the land is available on a subsidized rate, and it's a brownfield development. As you can see, it's not too much of construction on the site at the moment, so removing this would not be too much of a challenge in terms of sustainability goals we like to achieve. And then, of course, the buildings are following the codes that we want to achieve on this. And this is done in collaboration with the City Council. I will not stress too much on the case studies because I think we want to cover the methods and mechanism later. Another project is the one that I worked on when I was in UK and Bristol. This is in Torbay. This is a very successfully delivered project on a landfill site, and this land was made available by the council to sovereign housing, 144 residences. Again, the model that Paul mentioned, part of this is available on market, and part of this is catering to absolute needy, in demand sort of workers and health workers and social workers as well. So social housing covers about 70%, and 30% is 35% is about for sale. And the first challenge to us was that we want to make it sustainable, and it needs to look good as well, because it needs to look aspirational. It shouldn't look like we are gonna have a place at a cheaper rate, but then it is not gonna make any impression on the buyers. So that was also addressed quite interestingly, and in an impressive manner on this. Yeah. Next one. Now, scaling this further, the number of cities in India, they've got to go vertical, and the technologies do change, because up until 4 stories, 5 stories, you can follow similar technology of construction methods and all. But when you go beyond that, and believe me, in India, I think the population is so much that to achieve that, we have to go further up. And to go further up, there are technologies that then become challenging in terms of achieving the sustainability goals. Use of concrete or use of steel comes in play. Use of glass comes in play. I think the problem is that it's finding a balance between the two, and that's what we are doing in Jakarta at the moment. A number of smart cities in India sort of failed. Some of them failed, not all, I can't say, but some of them failed to find that balance. And I think that resulted in sort of creating a vision that is deliverable. So this is a very good example where we are addressing the need of rising middle class. At the same time, we are making sure that we are not derailing our sustainability mission. And we are making sure that we are working closely with the council. And I think the beauty of this is the shared vision to attract young talent, to make sure the land is available, to make sure it's sustainable, and not only on buildings, but also other parts of connectivity, water conservation, and various other points that we need to address as part of community and sustainability goals. Yeah. Next.
Yeah. So the next question becomes basically, how do we achieve this kind of success in Tamil Nadu? And then first thing we basically need to start with is the understanding community needs. Like what I would normally expect is people would want to have better living outcomes and live in the areas which give them, better living spaces than what they are living in right now. So that should be the focus, and that then only it makes, let's say, a house an aspirational house. Also, understanding the community needs which are bespoke to that location, bespoke to that culture is a very important point. From there, we need a lot of support from government bodies, be it in the form of subsidized land or some of the policy support or some of the incentives for sustainable focused developments. And having ticked that, then we need financial institutes to support this through green finance. And then we heard Atif talking about there are so many initiatives around it already in India, and then it's basically how we can access those funds, and how this can be made feasible for developers and even all the stakeholders. Ultimately, it should give benefits for all. We shouldn't think that if the project is focused on sustainability, it's going to be high cost and it's not going to be profitability focused and so on, because if we do it that way, then it's not going to be successful. So it has to be focused on that it gives benefits to businesses as well, so that the businesses can run. It also focuses on affordability of the end users, so that the initial capital investment is reduced, the operation cost is reduced. It gives a better living conditions in terms of health and well-being, or even mental wellness. It should at the end give a better quality of life, and also long-term benefits for all the stakeholders. One of the examples could be the government achieving its green targets set for the decades or even coming decades. So, and then, the various consultants and all the collaborators and many of the people who are on the call, we could be working together to make a proper business case to make this happen. It basically has to start in a very, very holistic fashion, that we start with a vision, we start with a shared vision, which is going to work for various parties. We have a proper benefits case, that this is in terms of dollars, that's what it means. And these are the intangible benefits which are coming out of it. All stakeholders need to be aligned to achieve that. And from there, we develop a plan. And now it may sound very obvious that, that the plan has to be in place, but then lots of ideas don't really have the proper plan developed. So it's very essential to have that plan in place, short-term, long-term, with clear timelines and milestones attached to it. And from there, we go to the mobilized community from various collaborators working together, and even the end users working with collaborators to make this whole vision possible. So there are various potential models which could achieve this, and Jitesh is going to talk about these.
Yeah, so we looked at it from a holistic point of view and thought how we can replicate the eco house that we work with SCAD and URBED, and looking at what are the possibilities in terms of developing and evolving the model. If you look at the first part, which is the immediate scaling up of an independent dwelling to an eco neighborhood, we would probably need to look at areas where the land is made available through. There are lots of CSR funds. If you might be already, or I mean, many of you might be already aware that there are corporates who are spending through the CSR funds, and there are corporates who are also providing housing to their employees. So if you look at the railway quarters, hospital quarters, university campuses, partnering with government through these opportunities could actually help us scaling up of the opportunity. In this case, the land is available at subsidized cost or zero cost. I think would be very difficult in the current market, but we should probably aim to get more grants and funding support. And then potential outcome, as we say, this could be a scaled up from the eco housing independent unit to multiple unit, maybe a combination of few independent houses, few apartments who are probably not too tall, so that we can apply the technology that is possible on the scale of development that we are looking at, and then replicating that either into the eco-village concept, where multiple of these nodes could come together and then build around the social infrastructure that we need to provide. Now, in India, there are lots of existing projects like slums or some of the redundant industrial areas. The cities are expanding, and when cities are expanding, it's eating up the spaces where usually the production used to take place in past, right? So the boundaries are going out, and a lot of industries are then turning into as part of the city. Now they can't operate in the city as per the new rules. If this industrial areas are sort of made available, or the slums are redeveloped with the concept, the idea, I think it sort of makes more sense with a subsidized land. I think land is the major cost in India at the moment, and making sure that multiple models are available in terms of delivering such an idea on ground. If we look at now going to sustainable transit-oriented development, now if you look at the densities around transit-oriented development in India, and rightly mentioned by ConnectedCities group, that in India it's unusually high, and to make it financially viable, it sort of needs to stay unusually high. In that case, we probably would need to look at how we could develop vertical units as well, and those vertical units provide enough return to the private sector. And of course, as Atif mentioned, that they partner with the banks, they partner with various stakeholders, but at the end of the day, those banks would look for return, and that has to be made sure to make sure this project gets to the end. A lot of projects, believe me, be it smart cities, be it a lot of other initiatives that I have seen over the last decade, I'm sort of struggling because at the end, either they are not having enough finances to support it, or not having enough wealth in terms of knowledge, in terms of ability to execute it. So I think we have a real good opportunity here to provide that knowledge, build it together, and look at an opportunity, look at a concept evolution further to deliver in all the three segments that we are looking at. Next.
Okay, I'm going to have to ask you to draw to an end.
Yeah, that's the last slide.
Great. Okay, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for raising some strategic options for the future, and for showing how one could get to a shared vision that benefits all the stakeholders. So it's a kind of win-win solution. So finally, to end our conference, I'm going to draw what often we've had at the beginning, which is the experience of SCAD. And I'm really delighted that we've got Dr. Peter Babu with us. And in a moment, I'm going to hand over to him. SCAD's name means Social Change and Development. And I can't think of a better name. I think you should be able to get returns just by sort of selling the name on to people, because it expresses all. So Peter, so over to you.
So good afternoon to everybody, and I'm very happy to meet Nicholas and Vimal and Jitesh. I'm very happy. It is a golden opportunity for us to also meet you and to share what we are doing. We are a non-governmental organization. It's a trust engaged in various rural development activities.
But can I ask, sorry, have you started slide sharing, because it hasn't come up yet?
Not yet.
1 minute.
Okay.
We can see the screen.
We can. Screen
Yes, it's come up now. That's great. That's wonderful.
Yeah. So ours is situated in the southern part of India, almost at the tip of India, I should say, called Tirunelveli, a little south of Madurai. And ours is a non-governmental organization. We are engaged in various activities in the rural development for the upliftment of the various neglected and socially marginalized people. We have main thrust, as our Nicholas was mentioning, our name is social change and development. We believe in that concept. So we have been doing the work also in the same way. So our main areas, thrust areas are education, holistic healthcare, the inclusion of neglected communities, community organization, sustainability, ecology, and environment. These are our main thrust areas. And as it was mentioned in the agenda, what is the next step for SCAD, for social change and development? As we are we are working from the year 1985, and we have adopted nearly 600 villages, and most of them are most neglected groups. And our engagement with the most underprivileged or disempowered people. And we are also concentrating on the role of women in the society, in education and other things. And we have also a plan for the sustainable development and to create a center. And as Scott's engagement with the disempowered or the neglected groups, we are working with the most neglected groups of our community, like salt pan workers, who are very vulnerable in their living condition as well as the working condition. They mostly live in huts, with one-roomed huts. Cooking, eating, sleeping, everything is in the same place. Those type of people, about 250 villages we have adopted for the salt pan workers alone. And likewise, the other groups like gypsies, normally they are nomadic, but we have made them more or less to have a quasi settlement with schooling and hostel and all, some community organizing activities. There's handicrafts making activities like that. And we have also been taking care of the neglected groups like leprosy affected people. We have a small mini hospital and also housing project for them. The leprosy affected people are stationed in one place and they are being taken care for the last about 25 years. We have another group called snake catchers. As you know, in India, we have a lot of snakes. And they have been living out of this snake catching. But now it is also forbidden. But we are trying to rehabilitate those people in other activities. Another major area where we work is also Palmyra climbers. Palmyra tree climbers are very, very risky life and work. Many of them fall down from when they are climbing. So we are working for their rehabilitation. And we mainly focus also on the children and adult community of disabled children. So there we have thousands of children we take care. nearly 4,000 people are our beneficiaries, both children and adults, by way of taking, disability care. And of course, we have one of our major areas is also small and marginal farmers development. We have in every village we have farmers association, and we give training in various advanced skills in the farming. And to support the farming, we also have water management, like deepening the wells, deepening the storage facilities. Uranis we call, they are like small lakes. Those type of things we do regularly. One another area is caring for the elders, orphaned elders. They are one of the most neglected groups here. And other people like single parents or orphan children. And we also take care the artisans, weavers, potters, those communities. These all are our main focus of our activities in this region, in our 600 villages. And there, the women education or the women's role empowerment plays a very major role. We have understood that in our community, if we educate and also if we organize the women, that will automatically develop the families and the communities. So we have made into various groups, small groups of about 20 people, 15 people like that. We have nearly 3,471 women self-help groups are there in all our villages, having about 45,000 members in it. These women self-help groups play a very vital role, very major role in the development of each village or each community. They are engaged in various activities. Every village women group are engaged in various different activities. That helps a lot for bringing up the development concept to them, and also to make them grow sustainably and eco-friendly and all that. And we have developed nearly 2,000, more than 2,000 successful entrepreneurs, micro entrepreneur and small and medium enterprises. And about 100 plus women self-help groups members are now very actively involved in the local body administration, and they are elected as president and ward members of the local body government. And that is a very good success for the in our system, because those villages can be developed when our people or the village leaders who have got the social awareness are the members or the leaders of those panchayats or the local body administration. And another area we have developed is the sustainable development. The Center for Sustainable Development. We call it as Garden of Delight. And there we do various things like promoting sustainable food system, sustaining sustainable the energy production like biochar, charcoal making, and also from wet waste to create some electricity. Like that we do lot of sustainable things like solar energy and wind turbines, and biochar, bioenergy also we do. So those type of things are being done in our Sustainable Development Center. And one another thing is to have we have eco housing with the support of our urban and URBED, Professor Nicholas Falk, and I am very thankful to Richard and Girish who have explained about the eco house and the eco sustainable aspects of the house. It has been a very successful one, and various people come and watch see that, It has become a model for many people to follow. And we do, as a sustainable matter, a lot of organic gardening we do. Nearly 16,000, nearly 2,000 gardens and 16,000 herbal gardens we have created in the villages, which is very, very good help for the villages. 2,000 gardens we make every year. That way it is making a real sustainable models everywhere in the region. And we promote also the biochar for soil fertilization and climate mitigation. And that has been very useful in the community. The farmers, more than about 400 villages, they have started adopting this kind of methods. And organic waste into energy or fertilizer, that is also very effective, because all wet and organic waste being used to produce energy, and some electricity production is also being done. And that way it is very useful, and that is ultimately helping as a fertilizer, very powerful fertilizer for the agriculture. And we have also this microbes, organic, effective organic microbes we are producing. We got the model from UK and then we are producing it here. And that helps to improve the productivity of the crops and improve the soil fertility, because in India, excess use of chemical fertilizers are there, done in all over India. So the soil is contaminated. So to improve the soil, we are actually using this microbes. If it is used for about 6 months, the soil becomes again organic and productive. Much more production is being done. And in the sustainable agriculture way, we are also doing some rainwater harvesting. Huge structures are being built and restored. The traditional rainwater harvesting structures are being done. More than 150, 165 water bodies, big and small ones, we have done in our area, so that they have the rainwater is being harvested and they are used for, again, agriculture. Solar and wind energy is also being used in excessively. Wherever it is possible, we are promoting it. Even for the most neglected groups like gypsies, they are using a small lamp for with the solar energy. And one of our major area is we give a lot of importance for tree planting, because this is an area where we are working with very little rainwater. And some years back when we started working, about 600 ml rainwater only for the whole year. And as a thing, we decided to plant more trees. We have planted more than 3 million trees in our adopted villages. And that has brought a change. Nowadays, I should say, the rainfall is more than in the earlier years. So that is all the work that we are doing, and we want to promote this sustainable model and the initiatives of SCAD Nirman to the wider community. We are targeting children, women self-help groups, members, students, teachers, NGOs, academic and research institutions, and volunteers, entrepreneurs, and general public as our stakeholders. And we are promoting this sustainable model as much as possible. Even the eco-housing is also one of our major area. But right now, we are interested in creating a center where all these things are being demonstrated, and training it can be given, and which can go into villages. That is the sustainable center is our one of our first priority right now. And I would like to really thank very sincerely Nicholas Falk, professor, for his great initiative by visiting us a few times and then promoting us also in this line. And I am very grateful to him. And other members like Vimal and Jitesh, all we are grateful. And all the members we are grateful for the wonderful initiatives that you are taking. We appreciate and thank each one of you. Thank you.
That was truly amazing. And I do encourage anyone who's interested to actually go out there. It's really not that, I know that it's difficult to travel anywhere, but there is a kind of golden, silver circle, I call it, which links Tirunelveli with Kerala, and you can really get there quite easily and have the most amazing experience and the most wonderful food. So thank you so much for that, Ketis. We almost reached the end. We realized that we tried to do the impossible, which is to pack in an amazing amount of experience with a variety of speakers in different countries, and thank goodness the technology has worked well. Thank you, John Breach, and thank you very much to Jesse at the Bristol Housing Festival for all that. I want to try to use the last few minutes to draw some conclusions about where we go from here over the next couple of years. I think it's always tempting to think about 2030 or 2050, but the journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, and we have to be thinking about what's to be done in the months ahead. I'm enormously grateful to the support that we've had from Bureau Happel, which indeed has made this event possible, and the fact that they're willing to continue to work with SCAD and ourselves. And they have raised three very interesting strategic options, it seemed to me, which tie in with many of the other things that we've been discussing today. They've talked about the idea of building housing for specific groups of key workers. And this does seem to be an important way of scaling up eco-housing or sustainable development, that you start with a specific group of users because you've taken at least one risk out of the development process. You know who your customers are going to be. And you mentioned, I think, groups like teachers or nurses, or it could be railway workers or whatever. I know that this is already something that has happened in India for many years. And it does seem to me that the kind of specialist housing developer that Paul Smith was talking about is probably going to be more interested in working with communities and the users than the average house builder. And so I think there's a very important role for the housing association, as we call it, if you like, not-for-profit house builders who are catering for a range of users. And I think the point you emphasized, Jitesh in particular, was the idea that you can, in the same development, cater for a range of different kinds of people and get a degree of cross-subsidization. So that seemed very important. You then mentioned the idea of going to eco-villages and the notion that you could indeed use space that already existed, underused space. And I thought that was a very important idea. It's what's typically called brownfield sites. And I know that it is going to appeal to the British government, at least, because it takes the pressure off the green fields. And then you've raised the idea, which is perhaps the most ambitious idea of all, and which ties in with what Brian Love and Camilla were talking about, which is to focus on underused land owned by the railway companies, who are huge landowners in all our countries. And I think the model that you described in Jakarta, it seems to me particularly interesting. And what I've been thinking about is whether, even with our very small resources, but big ideas, we can begin to sort of broker the kind of partnerships that are needed and to identify some pilot projects. It seems to me that what people are looking for, particularly investors, is not just reports and recommendations about what they might do, but a place where they could get invested in, and that in choosing those places, it's terribly important to have places that stand a real chance of success. The worst thing is to start in the area that nobody wants, and nobody ever sees the results. So I wonder whether you'd like to respond to that, Jitesh or Vimal, in terms of, do you see a kind of easy win? Do you see a kind of a particular place where if you can get hold of it, it really would make a difference? And I'm going to ask Paul Smith the same question. So first of all, from you, Jitesh or Vimal, where's one going? We're not going to build anything in the next 6 months or even possibly 2 years, but one could imagine reaching an agreement in that time and having the deadline of saying everyone's got to sign up to doing something which really is at some scale, the sort of scale that Outif and IFC would recognize as being important, and that the green finance sitting in the pockets of the bank will suddenly be passed over to people who can make good use of it. So, Jitesh or Vimal.
Well, Jitesh is an expert in master planning. I can tell what my opinion is. Probably the neighborhood pitch, which is focused on, let's say, the quarters, because government anyways needs to build quarters for railway workers or railway staff or hospitals, and these are the projects which have to happen anyways. So there's a clear interest would be there that the government needs these kind of houses to be built, and then there can be a pitch of, well, you could build these around the sustainable aspect so that these act as models for other private developers or even the other projects which will come in future. So, I mean, personally, I do feel that that is a larger potential and more certainty to happen earlier.
Would the term key worker describe what you're talking about? In other words, these are people who are critical. They support life, if you like, the teachers, the nurses, and so on. I don't know if you use
government
that term.
employees.
Government employees.
Well, they may be government employees. They may be teachers working for private institutions like SCAD, but whoever they're working for, their role, they have relatively low incomes and certainly very limited amounts of capital. If they've gone to college, they're probably the first in their family. So they don't have the capital to compete in the private market, and therefore, for that reason, need a helping hand. Is that what we're talking about?
No, I'm specifically talking about the government workers, where government provides the quarters or the
or even corporate. So, Vimal, I think one example I can give you is for Tata. I was involved in strategizing for the 2 campuses in Novamandi and Joda, which is like close to their Jamshedpur area. There they had worker accommodation, about 30-40 years old, run down, now need to remodernize it, very land demanding development. Back then land was available, it was easy to build on ground. Now they wanted to consolidate it. So we created that model for them that they can replicate in sustainable manner. So that was like for 3,000 employees. Now, 3,000 employees, we're talking about 3,000 dwelling here. And that was a scale of replicability with a client like Tata, right? And Tata would spend a little more because they have the trust, which looks after some of the incentives and sustainability. So we say, okay, this is your standard cost of construction, X thousand rupees per square feet. Now I need from your CSR fund some more amount to meet my sustainability requirement. These all are the potential expenditure, and these all are the social infrastructure that I need to provide which they already provide. I mean, Tata townships are absolutely flooded with the social amenities that you could see. But still, I mean, certain standard that they need from school, from performance, from institute or healthcare or etc. And that brought that whole community together. That was a good model that they got replicated in Tata Amalgamated Plantation, which is another site which is for Tata Tea, where the farmers provide the land, Tata invest in that, provide that whole development, and then of course they provide the housing on that. The scale of it is again around 1,500 dwellings. So what we're talking about is scalability of this can be found through government or from a large corporate through their corporate social responsibility or through their development of townships. Maybe TVS in Tamil Nadu is a big production house, right? And they would probably want to build housing for their workers. And this could be an opportunity for talking to TVS or talking to Mahindra or talking to some other production units which are there in the Tamil Nadu.
The important idea is that there's a dedicated group of people who form the community, and you can then start with them. But Paul, how would that idea work in the Bristol or Southwest area?
You're on mute.
You need to unmute.
I think I would have worked that out by now, wouldn't you, after we've been doing this for nearly 2 years? But I think the critical issue is locating the land. I think once you've got the land, and everything else can follow. And so, you know, particularly this public sector land, you know, not all owned by council, some of it's owned by railways, some of it's owned by the MOD. Making land available.
That's the defence.
Sorry, Ministry of Defence. That if you make land available, then everything else will follow. Okay. So you know, if I've got land, it's quite easy then to borrow money against it. It's an asset which the money will follow, and so it's the land that's critically important. I was quite interested actually in what Jitesh was just saying, because it sort of reminded me of the Bourneville village up in Birmingham, yes. built by Cadbury's, yes. and Bourneville around that, which is now a housing association that of 2,000 homes. Is that it used to be quite common for ethical employers to also provide their workforce with homes, and that is in this country is no longer true, not even in the public sector. I mean, accommodation for nurses, which used to be provided by the NHS, is no longer available, or you know, very, very rarely. And I think, you know, getting back to that, I know it's something that's been looked at in places like Cambridge, where you can actually get employers and sectors that are expanding to also build the housing to ensure that they can then get the workforce they require.
Well, that's very good, because it's sort of enlightened self-interest, we might say. And you're starting with an organization who has a concern to do a good thing, to leave a legacy, if you like, and not just exploit the situation. So that sounds as though there is a meeting of minds there. Cletus, do you have any reactions to what we've just been discussing, this idea that the key to starting is getting hold of the land in the right location, owned by an organization that's prepared, if you like, to put their land in as a stake and to wait to see the return on it, rather than selling it for the highest bidder. How do you react to that?
Here you see that if the government wants to give land for the homeless, there is one possibility. Then the land cost is not there. That is also possible. But it is very cumbersome and not easily done. But anyhow, we can also try that. One other thing is to buy somewhat cheaper lands, which may not be in the cities or the main places, but it can be a little interior, and the land cost can be cheaper.
Yes, well, land which is perhaps on the edge of the city which I think is the sort of thing that Brian Love and Camilla were pointing to, land which was on a railway line that leads out of the city. It may be 3 or 4 miles away, and therefore won't have the same value. But when you've created the kind of community that we're talking about, the sort of schemes that Neil Murphy was talking about in Cambridge, will suddenly become an attractive place and a smart place. And I do think that one of the important themes that's run through today is the notion of creating places that are aspirational, which people, it's not somewhere you look down on, but somewhere you'd say, oh gosh, I wish I could live there. I wish I qualified. Isn't that right? And it's got to give good first impressions. Any more? Autif, are you still on the call? Because I welcome reactions if you are. Autif, if you could unmute. I see your picture, but I don't know whether he's still there. Okay, well, if anyone else who would like to come in who's already spoken. Neil, what's your reaction to what we've just been discussing? So we're talking about the steps that you can take towards this longer term objective. We know that we want to build millions of homes which are affordable and sustainable in the right location. And the big question is how we get there in steps. You yourself have said that the challenge is getting things taken up. And the suggestion is, well, let's start with getting hold of the right land and finding, and it may be that it's government-owned land. I mean, I've shared a link to a statement from Michael Gove, which suggests they are prepared to mobilize public land for this purpose. So what's your reaction?
Yeah, I think it's very much the power of doing. And I think that, you know, so it's very important to do something at a small scale that you can get right in as many respects as possible. So obviously the housing, the building method, the sustainability credentials, but also I think in particular the urban form is that thing of, okay, if we did 1,000 of these, do we have a place that functions? So density and legibility and all the rest of it are really kind of key things. So because I think that if you do something that is genuine and exemplar, where actually if what follows, if each thing that follows then follows maybe 60% of it, then it will be okay, because we can't always get perfection, but if you're going to pour a lot of resources and efforts into something that's really about proof of concept, then it's worth trying to get that right. Yeah. And I completely agree with the point about land. It's always a difficult balance between taking what's on offer when it's on offer versus holding out for the best thing. But I think it is important that it's it's got some accessibility, it's got some amenities. If you're doing something at the scale of an urban block, you're not going to create a resolved settlement in its own right. So I think adjacency, those kind of critical adjacencies to the existing tissue are really important.
Yes.
So I mean, it's a bit like the sort of the Marmalade Lane thing, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned that thing of what would Orchard Park be like if Marmalade Lane had been built as the first parcel rather than pretty much the last one?
Yes.
And the answer is, well, hopefully it would have been better, but equally it would have mean Marmalade Lane would have been built in a field. So, it wouldn't have had some of the context that went before. So it is tricky. And I think that, making sure you're latching onto and sort of benefiting from existing economic energy in an area is really important.
So it may be that it's not just building on an existing neighborhood, but it seems to me the role of a college like SCAD could be vital because they already are an attraction. They're already generating activity and they have employees. I can see Charles there. Charles, would you like to say something about how you see these crucial next few months and what we should be really looking for, what proposition we should be making, if you like, because I've got the unfortunate task of writing up a report, and I would like not only to summarize the great things we've heard and the images, but be able to suggest a way forward. So what would be your answer?
Yeah, thank you, Nicholas. See, we got some good ideas from this workshop. some of the good examples, like Paul was mentioning about the Elim housing. So some of the initiatives already done, and there are some good models. And so if you're not going, so in case if you're able to find out some good space in and around Tirunelveli, I would say like we can go for the first set of cooperative housing for the staff members. That's what I was thinking. Of course, like we are planning for the Center for Sustainable Development. When you're upscaling the housing project, like there's a good scope, I think, like because there's already a lot of examples which we can take it from our friends from the workshop here. And so we got the other important thing is like Bureau Rapid is there to help us in so for the initial stage. I was talking to Vimal last week. She was very kind, like she wants to help us in the initial stage of both the housing as well as for the Center for Sustainable Development. I think this is going to be a good workshop and going to initiate a lot of things, I would say. And one of the reaction I would like to tell, like when Syed was explaining about the green, the support from the government. I'm not sure about Tamil Nadu government, whether they have initiated anything, but we can try. I've seen that in Maharashtra, Gujarat, those are the two states. They are giving a lot of green support for many of the initiatives. See, for example, we were discussing last week, the Ola scooters, which is launched recently in India, seems to be the biggest producer of electric vehicles, and it's produced in Tamil Nadu. But the cost of produced in Tamil Nadu, but the cost of vehicle is 25% higher than other states. So in Gujarat, it's 75,000 rupees. In Maharashtra, it's 75,000 rupees. In Tamil Nadu, it's 104,000 rupees. So Tamil Nadu, they are not giving any big support for green initiative, but still we can try.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it would be very good, I think, if we can see the result of this event being the launching of some pilot projects. Brian, in the few minutes that are available, do you have any responses to what you've just heard? And in particular, is the value in making comparisons across national boundaries? I mean, I'm amazed that it's sort of worked. We have actually managed to keep. I know we've gone a bit over time, but we've managed, the technology hasn't let us down. So I suppose the question is whether there's the human interest in actually doing what we've been trying to do, and to put that little bit extra effort into sharing the results and allowing other people to feed in. So it's seen as part of a much larger set of ideas, even though it's focused on specific projects. Brian, do you have a reaction? You need to unmute. Unmute.
Unmute. There we are. Thank you very much. Yes, I appreciate that. There is indeed benefit in collaboration, and I'm sure that will become more and more evident as time rolls on. This is not entirely new, but I think it would be good to have the opportunity to take it to a higher level. I greatly agree with what was said by Neil about the necessity for progressing in stages, but presumably stages in parallel, if we're to pick up on the three proposals that were at the end of the Bureau Rapid presentation, because I noticed that they all start in 2022. I think the key is land. I agree with that. And I suspect that for large-scale developments, there has to be an element of what the Americans call eminent domain. In other words,
we call compulsory purchase.
We call compulsory purchase in the UK. I have no idea what the Indian equivalent is, but I'm sure it exists. and it relies upon using the resources of the state in terms of power rather than money to decide that actually they want to have a particular kind of outcome and facilitate that. They won't necessarily make any money out of it, but they won't lose money out of it, but they will guide and direct the money, the effort, the energy. And I think that has to be the long-term solution for large-scale development. And clearly, for this to work, large-scale development is necessary. But in the short term and the medium term, I think the kind of projects that have just been discussed are absolutely essential test beds for all the problems that will need to be resolved. You can't immediately take a single building to a 500 building development. There has to be a series of intermediate stages. Yes. So I'm immensely impressed by what's come on. It seems to me that everything everybody has talked about actually combines together very well. And thank you very much, Nick, for putting this all into one package. It has a breadth that's not normally available in most conferences. But my only reservation is how quickly can we make this happen? From what Charles just said, I'm immensely encouraged. It sounds as though there are actually quite substantial plans underway. The question is, can we integrate what we're doing here in the UK, perhaps in Bristol, with what is happening in Tirunelveli? Well, and I suspect the answer is yes.
Yes. Well, I'd like Jesse Carter, who's one of the prime movers of the Bristol Housing Festival. I keep on trying to see if I can get her to make a response, because we've very deliberately set this up. So that our hope was that we would link in, not just with organizations such as Paul Smith's Elim Housing Association, but also people who are innovators or teachers or whatever in the Bristol area. We've already got a very strong link with the Centre for Alternative Technology at Machynlleth in Mid Wales. Adrian Watson has been involved in previous events. Unfortunately, they've had an outbreak of COVID just in the last day or so. And so he's been listening in, I think, but can't participate. But Jesse, would you like to say anything about the way forward from the point of view of linking with the Bristol people involved in the Bristol Housing Festival? No response. Okay. Well, at that point, I'm just going to finally say a few words of thanks. I'm going to thank the panelists who've done a wonderful job, more or less sticking within the 10 minutes that I asked them to do, which was an impossible thing. I'd like to thank the members of the audience, not as large as we'd have liked, but I think it's, as they say, small but beautifully formed. We will be taking the messages forward because this has been recorded and producing both a summary video, but also a report. And there's our team. I'm almost going to ask him to make the last word, because I think success would be not just that we had a valuable half hour, or that we learned, half day, or we learned some things we didn't know already, or maybe even made fresh connections. But in a sense, we started a process in which investment at scale would start to go into the things that we know are needed. And it's already been said, we're not just talking about houses, we're talking about neighborhoods, we're talking about communities, we're talking about people living better and in a fairer way, as well as wasting less resources. So Atif, do you have any message, if you like, from a mega organization about what we should be doing to ensure the good ideas are not lost?
I think the keyword has been mentioned a few times already, which is collaboration. Collaboration and transparency. I think those are two extremely important ways of moving this forward. As I said, there are a lot of opportunities already out there in terms of financing, in terms of technical support, in terms of actual delivery of projects. It's just that we need to connect better with each other and make sure that we are sharing data with each other to move this forward. I think that's the key.
Okay. Well, I think that probably is as good a note to end on. So once again, thank you to everyone. Thank you for Bureau Happel for sponsoring the event. Thank you for Bristol Housing Festival for allowing us to be part of your festival. Thank you once again, all the panelists for preparing their presentations, and I will do my best to try and draw out some conclusions and share something further, not just with you, but I have in mind that we send it to the government, who, and particularly our new minister, Mr. Gove, who's charged with levelling up the UK as well as all the other responsibilities of the Department for Communities and Housing and Local Government. So, thank you very much.